We'll move on to regular item 6A, file number AL2321, a special use request for Monument Glamping 1, modification to the special use request. And Ms. Matthey gets to come up here and there we go.
Right, I'm ready. Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Ashlyn Matthey, and the project before you is AL2321, Monument Glamping 1, the special use modification. Again, my name is Ashlyn Matthey. I was the planner on this project. Ed Schoenheit was the engineer. He is not here today, so Daniel Torres will be filling in. For public input, if you are watching remotely and have not provided a name and a reliable phone number, please email that information to pcdhearings@elpasoco.com. Hearing procedure, we will have a staff presentation, the applicant presentation, citizens in favor, citizens against, the applicant rebuttal, and then any questions for staff. This is the criteria of approval from section 5.3.2 for the special use. Please let me know when I can go to the next slide.
And for the audience, these are the criteria that we will consider as we hear this. And so we'll bring this back up during comments so you can address any comments to these specific criteria.
The request before you today is a request by Chris Jeub for the approval of a special use to allow a recreational camp with 12 sites. The background for this project, a complaint was filed with code enforcement in November of 2021. This is under CE 211158, and the complaint was for multiple outdoor structures on site, in addition to tents, bathroom facilities, and things of that nature. Code enforcement had sent a notice of violation to the applicant in December of 2021 due to these activities going on without the special use approval. In March of 2022, the applicant did apply for the special use for the recreational camp, and that first approval is under file number AL223. Due to the opposition that was received for this project was actually withdrawn, staff determined that the file number AL223 was eligible for an administrative approval with our department, and that was approved on July 26th of 2022. The plan for AL223 illustrates 8 tent or yurt sites with 4 shared bathrooms. Following this process is the site development plan process. This was under file number PPR 2253. This was reviewed by staff and approved August 3rd of 2023. In March of 2023, we did receive another code enforcement complaint about a recreational vehicle on the property. And then in June of 2024, there was a complaint for a shipping container on the site. The applicant was informed by staff that we would need to do another special use project for this due to basically having these additional structures on site that aren't a part of the previous approval. With that being said, in August of 2023, the applicant requested to modify AL223, increasing the sites from 8 to 12 and allowing a variety of different structures at the site. And with this modification, that means they could take different vehicles such as the recreational vehicles and shipping containers and move them to different sites throughout the property. So that is what is before us today. This is a vicinity map, so highlighted here in black is going to be our subject property. And then surrounding it, we do have RR5 zoning, we do have the town of Monument, and then in this pink area, that is the PUD zoning. Before you is going to be the site plan. This is what was submitted from the applicant for our project before you today. So you'll see that we have additional sites on here. We have another one down by the creek, and then there's additional landscaping information on here, fencing information. And so this is the new proposal of what the applicant has supplied staff with. Dimensional standards. So in the RR5 zoning district, the minimum lot size is 5 acres. The setbacks are 25 feet for front, side, and rear. And then the maximum lot coverage is 25%. The maximum height is 30 feet. And then we do have some notes associated with that down below. So for the master plan analysis, this area's place type is large lot residential. So what I wanted to discuss today was the analysis we have. So in this area, you'll notice that it's going to be larger lots. We're going to have an emphasis on the rural characteristic and then preservation of our environment in this area. So staff found that this place type was originally found consistent with the area. The project was found consistent with the place type for the AL223 file number. What we have before you today is an increase in the number of sites, and we're including now various structures such as recreational vehicles and shipping containers, which based upon that, we may see that this is not what we would normally expect in this area. It is surrounded by a lot of residential, but this is something we wouldn't normally expect to see in a rural residential area. And that's going to be because of some of the structures that they're proposing, which may not be as compatible with this place type.
Mr. Whitney.
Could I ask just one quick question before I lose track of it? Ma'am, when you say it was found consistent with the large lot residential, was that based on the lot size? Was that the extent of the analysis?
So that analysis with AL223 was due to this recreational camp having tents and yurts.
Okay.
So the first approval is for the 8 sites with the tents and yurts. What's before you today is an increase to 12 sites with the addition to have shipping containers and recreational vehicles.
So the original was deemed consistent with large lot residential, both because of the size of the lots and because of the use, tents and yurts. Okay.
The use being a different style of structures.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
The next master plan analysis is going to be the area of change. So this area of change is minimal change developed. And while this area is not to see significant change due to it being developed out surrounding it, the level of change with the special use before you today may not be consistent with the level of change we would see associated in minimal change developed. And that's going to be, again, because we are having a proposal for different styles of structures, such as the shipping containers and recreational vehicles. And then lastly, the key area is going to be the Tri-Lakes area. And this typically you will see a mixed use with suburban development, which we do see in this area, and along with this project is within the suburban development area. And by proposing a recreational camp, we would expect to see this to be more of a commercial service that could potentially bring tourism to the area. The water master plan, this is going to be in Region 2. It will experience growth in 2040. However, this is not a requirement for the special use to have a finding of sufficiency with water. For our engineering slides, I'm going to have Daniel Torres come up.
Morning, Commissioners. Daniel Torres with engineering. In terms of drainage, there is a FEMA floodplain on the property located on the east side that contains Monument Creek. No permanent type of development or storage of materials is permitted within the floodplain. The western portion is located within a Zone X, which is a minimal flood hazard. In terms of drainage, it is within the Monument Rock and Teachout Creek drainage basins. Fees are not assessed with a special use request. A drainage report was also not required with this application due to the low level of development of imperviousness for those 4 additional sites, campsites. The developer has stated within their letter of intent that it will not result in any negative drainage or erosion impacts to the adjacent or downstream. In terms of transportation, property is located along Rickenbacker Road, which is a rural local roadway. A traffic study was not required due to the smaller impact of traffic generated by the site, which is identified as 32 average daily trips for the whole development. The development is subject to the road impact fee, and there is no public improvements proposed or required with the special use application. Any questions on drainage or traffic? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Torres.
Next in the PowerPoint, I wanted to discuss the project-specific conditions associated with this site. So what I have before you is going to be a slope map. So this is showing slope on the property that is 30% or more. And I thought this was significant to understand when I go over the conditions of approval, why we do have those and why they were crafted. So this is showing when you're at the property, it does slope down. So the tent sites or other structures could be seen from other neighbors. This is a photo that indicates some of that slope right here. This is the property owner's house, and then this is where the slope begins into the backyard. Again, these are some more areas to show the slope in the area and why we did ask for various types of landscaping and screening to some of the sites so that there's no visual impacts to the neighbors. So I just wanted everyone to have an idea of what is going on at the property. So for this project, the applicant has not identified the number of glamping sites that will utilize specifically shipping containers and RVs. Therefore, it's going to be a little more difficult to determine the impact to the surrounding neighbors. With the utilization of the shipping containers and recreational vehicles, we do see that it may not be compatible with the surrounding rural residential neighborhood. With that being said, the applicant has not provided the up-to-date septic permits for this proposed use and has chosen to defer those to the site development plan. So with that being said, we do include a condition of approval tying them to that site development plan to provide that documentation to staff. With that being said, our conditions of approval are based upon also the mitigation of any impacts to neighbors, such as visual, noise, and light levels. What we have here.
Sorry, let me just interrupt you. Just a little point of education here. This, like everything else, is a multiple step process, not education for you, for the audience. You know all this, you can tell them that. So if this special use modification is approved today, there's still a requirement for a site plan to be submitted that would address the specifics that would that Ms. Matthey's talking about right here. So another opportunity, if people are still not satisfied, that there's another chance to come and work with the developer to change things should that be the direction that we go. So I just wanted to be clear that at each step of the process, there are different criteria that we use to approve or deny an application. At a different level of specificity is required. That's when the water decision will have to be made and things like that. So I just want folks in the audience to understand how this all works. This isn't we're not approving a blank check that says this or that, or we're not denying something without another opportunity for a level of specificity to be added to this application. Thank you. Please proceed.
Good explanation. So what I have before you are the conditions of approval staff has created for this project. There are 8 of them. I can read through them, or you guys can read through them, and then whatever questions you have, I'm here.
Mr. Trowbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I have a question about shipping containers. You mentioned shipping containers
Yes.
as part of the project. What are those considered? Are those considered permanent structures, semi-permanent structures, or is it considered some form of hard-sided tent, temporary structure, or how are they treated?
So we have classified them as hard-sided structures. Now, shipping containers are allowed. This structure is definitely not quite like a tent or a yurt. However, the applicant has asked that they have the ability to move these throughout the different sites if they need to. It is my understanding that Regional Building Department will not require a building permit for the shipping containers.
But is the shipping container considered just a storage
It would
device, or has it been modified to be a livable structure?
These shipping containers would be modified to be used as a glamping site where someone would camp at the subject property. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
One of your photos, that red structure that we saw in one of your photos is the shipping container that you're talking, the kind
That would
of,
be the RV.
that's the RV. Okay.
Yes, the red
okay.
one. Yes.
Looks kind of like a shipping container, but.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, okay, Ms. Fuller,
Can
and
you,
then.
can you go back to that picture with it? Because that to me looks like a tiny house on a thing. But
Yes.
what is that also in that picture with that? Is that,
So these pictures were taken with
Next one.
code enforcement a few years ago. So the site does look different now. These items aren't here because there are more tent sites and things like that. But
Okay.
this structure is the RV structure that we have been discussing and that one of the complaints came in about. The shipping container would be on the other side of the property from this.
okay. And that's a tiny house. That's not an RV. RV has the motor inside, doesn't it? It doesn't matter. I think it's just, looks like, oh, thank you, fifth wheel. Got it.
The shed or the barn, just to the right of that in the picture, and that's a storage shed, or is that the residence?
So this right here, this is the main residence. And then this was code enforcement photos of the complaint with the RV. And then again, the shipping container is going to be on the other side of that. And then there are large style tents and yurts as well at the property.
No, thank you for clarifying. It's hard to imagine the scope or the range of things that we could be considering here, but thanks, that helps. Mr. Smith had a question first, and I'll come back.
I'm still confused on the shipping container issue. You said that regional building does not have any concern with that? No permits required?
No shipping container. So with the regional building department, a building permit is required when a structure is over 200 square feet. 200 square feet or more triggers the requirement for a building permit.
So is that saying that they can or cannot put a cooking stove in there? Because we love to talk about cooking stoves.
You got me a little stressed out right now.
Don't mean to trigger. I just know that got into a rather extensive discussion.
Yes.
Still, Megan Harrington, Planning Director. The regional building does not require building permits. There's no requirement that we don't regulate what would be able to go inside of the structure. So as far as I would be concerned, yes, they could put in whatever type of equipment they needed within the trailer to do the recreational camping. I'm sure that the applicant will also address this as part of their application, but whatever goes in there would not be inspected by regional building because it is not considered a structure that is a permitted structure.
Very good. Thank you.
Let's go to Mr. Markowitz, or is this follow on to the?
Well, so I understand like the size wouldn't trigger that, but you could have multiple things that are under the threshold and that would not trigger an inspection ever.
No, regional building does not inspect shipping containers. shipping container being used for someone to live in. It is not considered a permanent structure through the Pikes Peak Regional Building Department. So they have no inspection, no building permits required.
So they don't even, like, you wouldn't, like, if they had 10 of them on there, they wouldn't add those together and, wow.
No, the similar if
Oh,
you're
I learned
using
something new
shipping
today.
containers for storage, if you're doing a completely different use, but just as an example, if you place those shipping containers on a property, there would be no requirement to go through the Pikes Peak Regional Building Department.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Markowitz.
Well, kind of continuing on that, you mentioned a 200 square foot limit on at what point does that come into effect? Of the structure. So if they took 5 shipping containers, cut off the sides, put them all together as one, now you've got a very large item that's going to be certainly over 200 square feet, but it still qualifies as temporary.
So I'm going to do my best here because I don't work at regionals. But what I can, from my understanding, per the Land Development Code, shipping containers are allowed in this zoning district. It's being used as a recreational camp. And if they were to propose structures that aren't outlined in this special use, that could possibly trigger a code enforcement
But the
issue.
special use is just saying shipping containers. It doesn't say, well, you can't tie 4 of them together to make one large building.
So I don't think we can, Commissioner Markowitz, I don't think we can answer that because once you tie them together and you start modifying the shipping container and to take the pieces of the shipping container, there could be, and this is where we don't work for regional building, but there could be a different building requirement if you start building a home out of shipping containers. Then it's not just an individual shipping container. So I would not want to comment on that. I don't know if the applicant has any information on that, but I think that now we're starting to shift and change. But a shipping container in its original configuration as a container would not require a permit through Pikes Peak Regional Building. So I don't want to go into if it's cut off and pieced together to a home, that may be a different occupancy.
And so if that were the case, if they were to take 2 of them, put them together, I mean, I've seen these all over online where people are building houses with shipping containers.
But that becomes a permanent structure.
And so you're saying if those shipping containers are modified, other than like cutting a window out or something like that, but if they're modified to be combined, that could trigger some additional enforcement. Would that be county? Would that be regional building?
At that point, it's a regional building issue of what they consider that structure. So if you put them together, you place them on top of each other, if you start turning it into a permanent structure, then I believe that's a different classification of structure type, and it would not just be the shipping container. But I don't know what that permitting process looks like. I don't know how much modification can occur to a shipping container before regional building puts it into an occupancy of a permanent structure as a home or a different type of structure.
Does the El Paso County Code have any kind of definition? Because I know that, we're getting into more desire for tiny homes, using shipping containers in these unique ways. There's all sorts of different housing structures that are going to become available. Do we not have anything in our code that defines what it is that's going to trigger more scrutiny?
Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I think that may be a conversation for another day. We're happy to answer that question. We've had tiny home discussions ad nauseum in the past, and so we do have some information that we could provide, but rather than try and pull that together here for you today, if we could come back with that, I'd appreciate it. If the commission is concerned about the use of shipping containers, then at the end of the day, just spelling out options, you can deny the application, you can put further restrictions on the uses as a condition of approval on the special use. As an example, you could add a condition of approval that says that if a shipping container is is used, it can't be joined to any other shipping container. I mean, you can address these things through your conditions of approval if you choose to approve it, and if these are concerns of yours.
Thank you, Ms. Segal. It struck me that perhaps the site development plan stage is where the sizes and locations of these things are set, and that would be a more appropriate place for the conversation, because then we would see some more specifics. Let me go, Mr. Whitney.
I just have a couple more points. So we're also talking about.
A second. I always defer to the county attorney.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I just want to clarify your statement, Mr. Bailey, particularly for the audience, that the site development plan is an administrative process. So it will not come back before this board, and it will not be subject to public comment, public input, public notice.
Thank you.
It's also mentioned RVs and or containers. The one that is on, if you can go back to that picture, that's a very large fifth wheel. And so if we're talking about putting up 12 yurts, that's a lot different than putting up 12 of these. And I would imagine that that's really what the neighbors' concerns are, is that it's going to balloon into something that is going to be extremely intensive on that piece of property. Because if you were to put 12 of those on there, it would be dramatic.
And that is a concern that has been voiced by neighbors, and our code has a definition for recreational camp, and that does not have a limit to the number of structures on a site, specifically to a recreational vehicle. However, we do have a zoning district called RVP, which is a recreational vehicle park. That does have a number, which is 2 or more triggers it. And so within the staff report, we related discussion of this due to some of the concerns by neighbors and what does this look like, and moving forward. So that is why our conditions of approval, we do try to tie in those impacts and things of that nature. And I think the applicant can perhaps speak more to what are we expecting on this site due to the lack of information that was received as far as how many RVs are specifically going to be on site or shipping containers, because that has not been specifically disclosed to staff.
And I have one more additional. It's related, because you just mentioned we have special code for an RV park. Are all of the RVs that are going to be allowed on this property strictly owned by the owner of the property, as opposed to the owner putting RV hookups on the site and then me driving my own trailer onto the site and parking it there? Because if you're bringing in outside trailers to a place where they can park and then hook up their electricity and or their water and sewage, then you're now getting into the RV park category.
I will defer to the applicant to address the style in which the RVs will be on there, and who exclusively will be owning those, and to go over that in further detail, because that has not been disclosed.
But you mentioned that an RV park, according to our code, I think you said considers 2 or more.
Yes, but.
And then that makes it an RV park. Versus if all these are owned by the owner, they're set in place, he's providing the electricity, I'm not driving on with a different vehicle and then just hooking it up, then that's one thing. If we've got 13 sites that people are going to be able to go pull their stuff up on and park on, that sounds like an RV park versus this glamping site that we had been talking about. So.
Yes.
Just would like clarification.
This is a concern by neighbors. It is a concern with staff as far as how many will be on there. But again, that has not been disclosed to staff. And while that information has been asked for, again, it has not been provided. So I would like the applicant when they come up here to do their presentation to answer these questions and to go into that detail that has not been provided, because our recreational camp definition does not disclose a number, but the trigger that staff sees would be that a RV park does note 2 or more, but our recreational camp definition does not provide a number.
Mr.
Doesn't have
Chair,
a limit.
Mr. Kilgore, go ahead.
Justin Kilgore, Planning Manager. I would like to second Ms. Matthey on this. I believe a lot of these questions could be answered by the applicant through their presentation. Also, the shipping containers, habitable space, temporary structures, those types of things can also be answered by the applicant. I know there's been some discussion with regional on those types of things, but again, as Ms. Harrington was saying, those are questions for regional, but I believe the difference we're looking at here is I don't think these are being permanently installed into the ground with a concrete foundation, plumbing, and all those types of things. So I believe that is one of the triggers that regional has, whether or not it is a permanent foundation type of structure as well, and it's habitable space. So I believe the applicant and through their presentation can answer a lot of these questions.
No, I agree. I was going to suggest that. I know we had some other interest here, and just on the definitional thing, I think part of the problem is because this doesn't fit neatly into a category that we already have, that's why we're bringing in different, we're considering different definitions, because this thing that is presented to us today doesn't fit into any of our existing definitions, so we have to figure out which criteria to apply and how to make this all work. Mr. Whitney, you had a question, and then Mr. Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we will hear from the applicant.
Yes, I know. So I was about to say, I can't wait to hear from the applicants. It's going to be interesting. I think I share the concern that Mr. Markowitz and Ms. Matthey and others have. I'm concerned about a blurring of the definitional lines between recreational camp and RV park, recreational vehicle park. So I'll be very interested to hear. But I gather the context, or at least the setting as we understand it at the moment, is this was previously approved as a recreational camp. And they're looking for a modification to that prior approval as a recreational camp, not as an RV park. So the question is going to be, I think, based on the answers we hear from the applicant, and to the chair's good point, where does this fall? And that will have a lot to do with how we figure this out, I think.
Mr. Carlson, we'll wait. Okay, Mr. Smith.
I think this one's really simple. In terms of the setback required by the zoning, does that setback only apply to what's considered a permanent structure?
So this will apply to any structure. So the setback in our R5 is 25 feet. On the site plan, the applicant does note that various sites do exceed that. And I believe the smallest or the lowest setback closest to the minimum is only 1 or 2 sites, and that's going to be somewhere around, I think, 39 feet.
If you go to the prior slide, to the one you're on right now.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
Down in the bottom left-hand corner of that map, those lighter colored, on their lot, right in there. What are those light colored things?
So the first one here in the corner, that is the shipping container that staff or code enforcement did receive a complaint about, because it is within the setback, and if this project is approved, that structure is to be moved out of the setback and to go into one of the sites that is compliant with the setbacks of RR5 zoning. The other structure, I believe, so this RGIS is indicating some of the current tents that are on the property. So my understanding is this one, and I'm not 100% sure, but I do know that some of those tent sites are existing on there. The GIS imagery capturing all of it might not be as accurate, but I know that the applicant does have tent sites currently and has the RV and shipping container out there.
Perfect, thank you.
And we have no idea when this picture was taken.
Yes, that's the other thing. So this RGIS is accurate, but I don't know has this been 1 to 2 years?
Sure.
With the image.
Thank you. Okay, back to you. Thank you for letting us take you off your off your presentation for a few minutes, and we'll
That's
come
all
back
right.
now and let you take a breath and put us back on track.
Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just fast forward a moment to the conditions of approval that staff has crafted for this project. And again, so this is to help with mitigation of negative impacts to the surrounding neighbors, because we do have neighbors that are near this property, and some of those sites are right by the property lines. So we do have some limitations on noise levels, lighting. We have disclosed at the special use plan some landscaping notes were provided on that site plan, and then at the site development plan, we will be capturing a more in-depth look at what that landscaping is, the screening items for those specific sites. In addition to that, we do note the road impact fees that would need to be added if more sites are approved with this project, and then we have some timelines set in to get that project in as well. And with the RVs and things of that nature, we do tie in that if people were to bring generators and things of that, we want to see a significantly larger setback so that we're reducing that noise level to the neighbors as well.
Thank you. Mr. Smith,
I hate to keep asking these things, but I'm sorry.
that's why we're here,
Yeah.
is to ask these questions.
Number 5, the applicant shall be required to connect all sites to an individual or community on-site septic system approved by El Paso County. Does that truly mean all sites, or does that mean all outhouses, restrooms, whatever the case may be?
So because certain information has not been disclosed, we wanted to make sure we had conditions of approval that could help not just the applicant, but give the neighbors some sort of mitigation as well. And so this comes from because we do not have an up-to-date commercial septic permit for this property. So based on whether they did have more RVs out there, or we just have those 10 sites, or they are perhaps more shipping containers, we're going to be able to receive an up-to-date commercial permit for that upon the submittal with the site development plan. And based on what the health department does ask for, we will get that information. And this is a way to ensure that we do get the proper septic for health and safety at this development.
So reality is you put that in there to kind of force a really hard look. You're not really saying if he has 5 tent sites with 1 bathroom between them, all of those 5 tent sites have to have a septic system run to them.
So on this project, there are 4 shared bathrooms. So we want to ensure that when we're adding more sites, does that mean that we're going to need another septic permit? What does that look like? And we haven't received that information. So this condition of approval is ensuring that based on what the health department does ask for, that we are getting that information and that it's creating a safe and healthy site for this development, because we haven't received that document from the applicant because they've asked to defer it to the site development plan. So I wanted to ensure that we will get that information and that it is up to date and accurate with the new proposal.
I understand. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Markowitz.
Number 3, and maybe this is just nitpicking, but all lighting should be turned off. That sounds like the lights inside need to be turned off. Should it say exterior lighting? Because I mean, you can't expect if you've got person in that RV that's just on the site there to have to extinguish everything at 10 o'clock inside.
Staff can update that. You as the Planning Commission board are allowed to alter, change, or add or delete conditions of approval. And I do see how this could be confusing. So what we can do is update that language to this condition of approval to make sure that it is clear and direct when being read by anyone who is to look at this project.
That it's exterior lighting. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just writing that down.
Nope, that's good.
And then we have the hearing notification slide. So our department notified 29 adjoining neighbors on May 23rd. For this project. Responses are within the packet. We did receive public opposition and support. The opposition consists of safety, traffic concerns, a lack of compatibility to the surrounding area, and then some of those code enforcement complaints that have been received as well. And then the support that was received was noting a boost to tourism and that this does not affect the community negatively. And then I can bring up the applicant.
Yep, thank you. We're going to take a 10-minute break first, and then we'll hear from the applicant. But thank you for the presentation, and we will be back here in 10 minutes.
Okay.
According to the clock on the wall. Stand up and stretch. I try not to use the hammer too much, but I will if I have to.
Come on, Thor.
Oh, we're missing Ms. Fuller. So I'll stall here for a minute while we wait for her to come back. And I guess we'll go ahead and start as you do the fine points of your introduction. I will ask if anyone who plans to speak, if you come up to speak on this, that you please fill in your name and address and the information on, I think there's a couple of sign-in sheets here. That way, when we transcribe the audio into the minutes of the meeting, we have the correct spelling and can identify everyone. That's why even the staff identifies themselves. So if you do come up and speak to address the commission, please make sure you've signed in with your information so we have all of that. And now that we're all here, the applicant will go ahead and make your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Planning Commission. Craig Dossie with Vertex Consulting. Mr. Carlson, Mr. Bailey, congratulations on your additional term, making Planning Commission great again. Appreciate that. So we're here to present and represent Chris and Wendy Jeub on the Monument Glamping special use request. We tried to take some notes during Ms. Matthews' presentation. I think we can answer hopefully all the questions and maybe clarify a few things, but try to go through the presentation, and then if I miss something else, please let us know. So Ashley went through what the request is. It's a request for a special use for a recreation camp under the definition of recreation camp in the Land Development Code. But essentially what you're talking about today is adding 4 sites, because 8 sites has already been approved. As Ms. Matthew identified, we're basically expanding it by 4 sites. This is a really long definition for recreation camp, so I want to kind of break it down for you and why the Jeubs felt like they fell into this, and then when we looked at it, why we felt like it fit into that, and maybe try to create a distinction between RV park and recreation camp. So the first part of it is a place used as a destination point for visitors. I think that's probably universal between RV park and recreational camp. But where it changes, it says it may include permanent structures and temporary facilities. That's permissive. It may include permanent structures and it may include temporary facilities. So there kind of lies why there's sort of a mix of overnight accommodations on the site. This definition says such as tents or yurts. There's obviously tents being proposed. You see one on the slide here. But what it really comes down to is it's overnight accommodation for guests. This says it may contain cooking facilities and none of the internal to the units. But the big one and what you see with RV parks is it's intended to be temporary. It's 30 days, not to exceed 30 days or a total of 90 days in one calendar year. That's how you make sure it's not, homeless people sleeping in tents on a property, which you're seeing in other areas and you're enforcing against. But then the definition goes on to kind of expand on this, and it specifically says what's not allowed. And that's hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters. Those are permanent structures. Those are regional building permitted structures. But it says it would also include land uses commonly considered as campgrounds, dude ranches, resorts, or retreats. That is a huge scope of what is included in this definition. I think that's part of the struggle of, does this actually fit in this? That added sentence makes it pretty broad. And when we think about campgrounds, you have to think about places like state parks, and you have to think of places like KOAs and Jellystones, where you have a variety of different structures and different overnight accommodations that are being provided. They're not required, a KOA is not required to show where people are going to put a tent or where they're going to put an RV park or RV or maybe a tiny home. So it's pretty loose. And I think it's intended to be loose so that it's encouraged. It's something that can happen in the community, but it requires a special use. And that's why we're here today. I will also note that your staff has determined that both what's there today and what is being proposed meets that definition. They have not said that this is an RV park. So we're operating off the same assumption that this fits within that definition. So just a little bit of background. Ms. Matthew went through this. I'm going to go through it very briefly. Again, there wasn't a previous approval for 8 tent sites. The reason why those are called tent sites is because the site plan labeled them as tents. But again, the recreation camp definition allows for more than just tents, as you just saw. So this was before we got involved, but I think the Jeubs, sort of thought that under that definition, we can bring on whatever fits within that definition. It's not just tents. They were wrong because that obviously got an enforcement action against it. But they did get approval of site development plan once they realized they needed to be doing the special use and then the site development plan. And then they also did pay at the time the road impact fee. So there's actually been quite a bit of neighborhood outreach. Probably the reason why we got a lot of people here, believe it or not. Back in May of last year, the Jeubs hosted an open house. I don't think there was a lot of attendance, unfortunately, but there were other attempts. Back in December of 2023, there was an online neighborhood meeting. I viewed that tape. There were some folks that participated in that, fully open to question and answer. And then since then, there's been a lot of ongoing discussions between the applicant and various neighbors. Obviously, there may be other concerns that are brought up today. We want to be very transparent in what we feel like the impacts are to the neighbors and how we feel like the proposals addressing those impacts. So the first one is smoke from fires. I assume that also means fires, right? I mean, that's a sensitive area, especially anywhere west of I-25. There is no firewood allowed to be brought on the site. There's no burning of firewood. It's only propane. So it's very, very controlled at each of the sites. One of the other concerns, which is always going to be a concern for, frankly, any kind of non-residential use, maybe even residential use, is visibility. With this application, the applicant is proposing additional screening on that north side. The reason why there's not any being proposed on the south side is that property owner is actually in support of this application. So you'll see on the site plan the areas where we've identified additional screening. Obviously, that's going to be fully implemented with the site development plan. But in order to afford things like that and to rebuild the road to satisfy the fire district, there needs to be more revenue. 8 sites just doesn't bring in enough. With 4 more, it can help pay for some of this stuff. It's just the condition of a startup business. The concern is transits will move in. Obviously, these are all paying patrons that are coming onto the site. There's no homeless occupancy of the site. It is private property, so he could have them evicted from the property for trespassing. There's a concern that tents will turn into trash and debris. I think that's a good point. The Jeubs obviously are very committed to operating a good business. Otherwise, you don't have a business. But that's also why you see some of these other structures that have been brought in. I shouldn't call them structures because they're not regular structures, but these other overnight accommodations is because they hold up better, right? If it's just all tents, you're constantly turning over tents. But it is a business, and if they have things that don't look good, they're not getting good reviews in the world we live in now. If you're getting bad reviews online, nobody's coming. And so that is very important to them to make sure that they're keeping the site very attractive, and more importantly, the places where people are going to lay their head are very attractive. And again, that's why some of the hard-sided structures are coming in. I'm going to show you pictures of those. I think they're pretty attractive. I was actually very surprised when I saw them myself. Another concern that has come up is land values. There's no evidence out there. There's no documentation that anything like this would reduce property values. Obviously, it's a nice area of the county. It's keeping it very rural, so we don't think that is necessarily a valid concern. So as Ms. Matthew did, I'm going to walk through the criteria from the applicant's perspective and try to cover why we believe we comply with all the criteria. So the first one is general consistency with the applicable master plan. Again, that's a document that this body adopted. So hopefully it's near and dear to your hearts as the Planning Commission. The site sits within the key area of Tri-Lakes. The Tri-Lakes area, is commonly kind of looked at as sort of a bedroom community for probably Colorado Springs, but also Denver. It includes Pike National Forest and so many other amenities. And I think that's key to this application is those amenities are what attract people to this area, right? It's the Air Force Academy, it's the National Forest, it's Black Forest, it's so many other things in that area. And that's why people are coming to stay at Monument Glamping. Well, the sentence that we highlighted here, future development in this area should align with existing character and strengthen really four things: the residential, commercial, employment, and entertainment opportunities in this area. Providing overnight accommodations and frankly, kind of unique overnight accommodations, we believe helps strengthen commercial, employment, and entertainment opportunities. You're giving people an opportunity to experience our area of the world in a much different way than going to a 300-room hotel. This type of use is very low impact. It's not, I was trying to do the math in my head, which is always dangerous. But at the acres that the Jeubs have, you could do something in the neighborhood, I think, of 17 single-family lots based upon the development just to the east. That's not what we have here. We have 12 glamping sites. In terms of area of change, it was highlighted that this is the minimal change developed. And again, I think if you came in with 17 single-family residential lots, that'd be significant change. This is not significant change. The site itself is remaining largely intact with native vegetation. The verbiage from this section of the of the master plan says this may include isolated pockets of vacant or underutilized land. I think given the growth pressures that our area of the world is seeing, to have over 6 acres of largely undeveloped land probably categorizes as underutilized, particularly this close to an urban environment, which is a shared boundary with the town of Monument. It goes on to say, regardless of the development that may occur, if these areas evolve to a new development pattern of different intensity, their overall character can be maintained. We feel like the rural character of this area is not upset by a recreation camp. It's very open. There's not 40-foot tall buildings. The traffic is so minimal that we weren't even asked to do a traffic study. So we feel like this is a great transition between a pretty urban area in the town of Monument, which is frankly traditional subdivision just to the east, and that more rural area transitioning up to the National Forest. So the place type, as Ms. Matthew said, is large lot residential. I don't need to go through this. I will say that some of the supporting uses include parks and open space, commercial retail limited, but also commercial service. That's exactly what we're talking about. Overnight accommodations in a very low impact way is a commercial service and is very limited. This isn't a huge operation. All right, we have 12 sites that we're proposing. That's about as limited as you're going to get and still be within the large lot residential place type. So the character statement for large lot residential says, while large lot residential place type is defined by a clear set of characteristics, the different large lot areas that exist through the county can exhibit their own unique characters based on geography and landscape. I kind of touched on geography being immediately adjacent to the town of Monument and the subdivision development that's to the east, but landscape's a big one here. It's hard to tell from the photos, but Most of this site drops off dramatically towards the creek. Most of it cannot be seen from the road. Very limited visibility into the site. It actually provides a very secluded environment for people that want to have this experience in our region. We think it's a pretty special property. That whole creek corridor is very special. So I think this hits really hard on maintaining that character. It's tucked away, it's low impact, and because of the geography, it provides a great transition between the city and the country. And I think that's hard to find. There's so many areas of the county where that transition is so defined. And frankly, that allows, in the future, that's going to allow for more encroachment of the city into those rural areas because there isn't that transition. We're adjacent to the incorporated area, but what the master plan calls out is that it should be important to ensure that there's appropriate density and use transitions for new development between these varying place types. So we have incorporated area place type, large lot area place type. You have something that's proposing to continue to be there with a minor expansion that provides a great transition between the two. It's close enough to those areas to serve overnight guests, but it also is low impact enough to transition to the rural area. So you probably don't get to see chapter 5 that much when you're considering items because you're probably looking at chapter 3 on land use because you're looking at subdivisions and maybe some commercial stuff, but this is a big one. Economic development is something that should always be in the forefront of everybody's mind that's a resident of this county. It's the engine that drives everything. It's how we get our roads paved. It's how kind of the engine works in this area. And the chapter 5 says that El Paso County should try to strengthen their overall economy through business collaboration, workforce expansion, and new development. Whether you like it or not, this is development. We can admit that. But it's so low impact compared to what you all see every day when you're up sitting on the dais. This is new and it's different and it's uncomfortable for some people, but it's something that the master plan is championing. And I read that to mean new businesses, not just so new development. When it comes to economic development, you're obviously talking about new business. This is an upstart business. They're trying to survive. This is part of that process. Goal 3.1 even says that the county should try to recruit new businesses in support of the development of growing sectors. The tourism industry in this county has always been strong, but it's getting stronger. That's why you've seen City of Champions type projects coming out of the ground. That's why you're seeing so many hotels being built. I can't count how many hotels have been built in the last 5 years. You're seeing this push for the tourism industry to continue to grow. That's something that the master plan clearly supports. In terms of business development, and this is verbatim, the county should actively support initial efforts to support entrepreneurs and small new business startups. That is exactly what we're talking about. That's exactly what the Jeubs have done. It's hard enough to start a business. Those of you that have done it, I just recently did it. It's tough, right? You're trying to pay your bills. You're trying to be in compliance with all the regulations that you probably weren't even aware of to begin with. But the county says they need to be supported, and not only supported, but actively supported. So I touched a little bit on tourism, but Chapter 10 really focuses on that. The core principle, this is pretty rare, where a core principle, I think, directly applies. The core principle, the highest level principle in this chapter says that we should maintain and expand the county's recreation and tourism options. Not just tourism, but tourism options. This is a different option than traditional overnight accommodations, than hotels and motels. Not everybody can afford to stay at the Broadmoor, right? People are looking for a different experience, maybe a more affordable experience. But the core principle says we got to provide options or we're going to lose out on some of that tourism. This chapter goes on in goal RT1 to say that the county should support high quality, sustainable outdoor recreation as a key amenity for both residents and visitors. Glamping, this recreation camp is exactly in keeping with that. People can experience the outdoors. We have pictures showing kids actually outdoors, which is so rare nowadays. It's so important to continue to offer that to people that want to come to this area. Get kids outdoors, get families outdoors so they can spend that time together. Goal RT3 says the county should explore projects, programs, and initiatives for enhancing tourism, not maintaining, enhancing tourism. What does that mean? I think that means being open to new ideas, new concepts for how we accommodate tourists coming into this area. And it's not just picking out areas along the highway or downtown. It's saying we need to enhance tourism by being open to what might come through the door. There's no way you can predict what the next option is in terms of overnight accommodations, or what you can predict what the next tourist is going to expect when they get to the Pikes Peak region. So I'm sorry, that was criteria 1. I will speed up. The next criteria is the harmony criteria, making sure that it's in harmony with the character of the neighborhood. I'm not going to go through the site. You have this in front of you. This is more just for reference. I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures. Maybe you can form your own opinion about what you think the visual impact actually is. So this is probably the most sensitive side of the property. This is the north side. There was a lot of snow that day. My feet got really cold, but this shows you there is actually scrub oak there. Obviously in the summer and fall, this provides really good screening. There are additional screening fences that are already there. There's more being proposed as part of this application. This is the side that the Jeubs wanted to be sensitive to based upon neighborhood input. They're not shying away from that, right? They don't want to be a burden in the neighborhood. They want to make sure that they can screen these things, keep the use internal to their property, and not try to create something that nobody wants to look at. That's why you're going to see some of these overnight accommodations. They're pretty attractive. So this is looking that same direction. This is looking north from that site. You really can't see anything. And a lot of it's the vegetation, but a big part of it is the topography, which I touched on before. It's really kind of sunken in. It's kind of hard to see. You can see this, you can't even see the structure that's next door. So this is now looking east at the north end of the property. This is one of the tents down in the creek area. We've already gotten comments from the floodplain administrator. They have no concerns with this. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has no concerns with this. They did say these need to only be tents, which we've done, and there can't be septic, which we've acknowledged, and we're planning for septic outside of the floodplain. But when this grows up in the summer, obviously there aren't too many people that are probably brave enough to sleep in a tent in January. I'm not. But when this grows up, you really can't even see this. And then this is a shot looking north along Monument Creek. Beautiful area. This is the recreation part I was talking about. I don't know how many kids get to grow up next to the creek. Probably not too many unless you're from the south. This gives kids an opportunity to play, to just walk through nature. But you can see the topography here really shields this area really well. Looking kind of southeast, this is again down the creek. You can see the development, Town Monument, which is nicely buffered by the creek because there are no sites on the other side of the creek next to those homes. This is, again, this is a great environment for families to hang out, get away from work and school and all the pressures of daily life. It's just a really unique setting. So this is a view looking towards site number 7. You can see the opaque fence to the right. A lot of vegetated screening, but what you can't see looking to the south is the next door neighbor. And again, that neighbor is actually in support anyway. I believe that home is actually the closest to the shared property lines. They don't have issue with this. You can see there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of topography that comes into play to help screen this and try to protect some of those visual impacts. In terms of the quality of the structures, I put this in because I think this is a very attractive place. I would stay in something like this for sure. Nice front porch. Again, this is looking to the west. You can see all the vegetation. This is actually looking towards the road. You can't even see the road hardly. It just gives you an idea of what you're really looking at. And it kind of highlights why it's important to go to the site and look at it rather than look at an aerial. There's so much more going on the property. So I mentioned the house to the south. Again, I believe this is the closest one. Very heavily screened. They're not in opposition at all. But it just, again, it highlights that this is kind of a walled off environment. So the next criteria is impacts, making sure that we're not overburdening capacity of public facilities or any of the services. There's an existing well. The Jeubs have the water rights to serve that. That's a legal evaluation that's made by the state engineer's office. Your staff highlighted that there is no water sufficiency finding. We agree with that. There is an additional engineering system, septic system being proposed. Just like any business, they're not going to put that in unless they know they need it, right? That's this process, making sure that if they get their approval, they can go get their permit from El Paso County Public Health and construct that septic system. But they're not going to build it in advance. You don't build wastewater lines in a subdivision before you know you have a subdivision. Same reason you don't put in a septic system before you know you need an expanded septic system. They have an existing commercial septic system that serves the use today and is permitted by El Paso County Public Health. That was one of the questions that I think came up. I mentioned that the traffic that's generated by the increase, so by all 12 units, was so minimal that the county staff, your engineering group, did not require a traffic study. In fact, we also believe that a lot of the background traffic that currently goes on Rickenbacker is a lot of that's going to go away. That development that's to the east in Monument built a road, Willow Ranch Road, that goes from Baptist all the way to Monument. Most of the cut-through traffic is going to go that way now. That has not always been there. So we feel like that's going to alleviate a lot of the background traffic. You won't even notice the traffic of the expanded use here. Monument Fire had no formal comments on this. We did talk to the fire chief. Fire chief had concerns about the existing access coming into the site, not at Rickenbacker, but kind of getting through the site. The Jeubs have agreed to reroute that so that it's not as steep. And so that it can be a better access getting into the site in the event of an emergency for the fire department. Next criteria is whether or not there'll be any unmitigated traffic congestion and making sure that there are no hazards created as a result of traffic. Again, access is from Rickenbacker. See if I can use my mouse. So Rickenbacker is here. The only way to get to Rickenbacker, you can do sort of a circuitous route way back to the west, coming in off Spats, or you can come off Fairchild down from the town of Monument. The road that I was talking about that's going to relieve some of the background traffic is going to be the Spike Butt Court, which is also Willow Ranch Road. This actually goes all the way down to Baptist Road and connects up to Cynthies at the north end in the town of Monument. So, in terms of traffic impacts, you almost have to take a reduction because there's less background traffic there now than there ever has been. The owner has agreed to obviously pay the additional road impact fee for the additional 4 units. That's not an issue at all. The next criteria is whether we're in compliance with all the applicable criteria or regulations of state, local, and federal. Staff has not brought up any concerns with any of that compliance. Highlighted that we do have water rights for all 12 units. The state has permitted the well. There will be an engineered septic system for all 12 units. There's currently a commercial system for the 8 that exist. There is a clearance from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's no light or noise pollution. I think the condition of approval regarding light, I think the spirit of that makes sense. And in terms of implementation, there's going to be headlights and flashlights. People that need to get up and use the bathroom in the middle of the night want to make sure that they can do that safely. I would recommend that's any exterior permanent lighting maybe would be regulated and turned off. But we don't feel like there's any issues there. There is no record of noise violations under the county's noise ordinance. There's no negative odors that are associated with that. You haven't seen any of those complaints either. I highlighted the safe access from Rickenbacker. Again, no traffic study needed, no offsite impacts, no offsite improvements to any of the county roads needed. So we feel like this checks all the boxes when it comes to ordinances and state requirements in terms of the water. So the next criteria is whether the special use will not otherwise be detrimental to public health, safety, and welfare of both the present and future residents of El Paso County. This is a little bit of the touchy-feely, but I think it matters. When you lose uses like this, you lose something that gives people an outlet. People can't be in their living rooms every day. Frankly, I hope they're not just in their backyards every day. They need to get out and experience the place that they live or the place that they're visiting. We feel like this gives them an opportunity to kind of improve their overall well-being, but it definitely provides for family togetherness. The maximum occupancy in any one of these units is 2 people, unless it's a family, then it can be 4, right? But it allows for families to come in and experience the site. We feel like it's a very low impact, and it is a rural land use, as opposed to what you would get with an RV park, right? An RV park is only RVs. That's not what's being proposed here. We don't feel like there's any unmitigated impacts with the additional screening that's being provided with the condition of approval that staff has proposed to you. I think Ashley even said with the conditions that they could mitigate the applicants could mitigate their impact. We agree with that. At the end of the day, this is small business, and it's integral to a healthy local economy to have small businesses. Businesses are born and die every day. And if new ones aren't being born and supported, you're not going to have new businesses that start. You're only going to have dying businesses. So we feel like this really supports the ever-increasing tourism industry in the county. Next criteria is whether special use conforms or will conform with all the county's rules, regulations, ordinances. I touched on that quite a bit earlier. There's been no issues raised by staff regarding compliance with those ordinances and regulations. Obviously, the way that you really materialize that is through the site development plan. Mr. Chair, you brought that up, that is a process. There are black and white criteria that the applicant's going to have to meet that come in Chapter 6 of the Land Development Code, and that's ultimately reviewed by the county staff. I don't know if these letters got into your packet. I'll give you a chance to read these. There's 2 letters of support here in addition to a map that I'm going to show you. I think these are very, very glowing letters of support. You got that one? Okay. I'll move on to the next one then. I don't think you got this one. Did you get this one? Oh. She's on the ball. Okay. It's stealing all my thunder down there. Okay, thank you. Any questions on either of those before I move on? Thanks. So Mr. Jeub put together this exhibit. The green dots are those that are in support. The blue show those that are in opposition. I went ahead and put dimensions on here. They're pretty rough. It's from the property line to the property line of where the blue one is or the green one is. It gives you an idea of the scale of the quote unquote neighborhood that we're talking about. You know, we're getting opposition from over a mile away that likely don't drive the same roads. Just a little bit of perspective when you consider the responses that you got. With that, we'd happily. Oh, let me address some of the other concerns. So one of the conditions required connection to a permitted septic system. Obviously, we don't want to connect tents. We really don't want to get into the floodplain. I think there has to be septic systems that serve all of the sites. That's the plan. That's why we're going through the process of getting another septic permit to allow for the capacity to be met. So there are shared community bathrooms on site. The question that came up was on RVs. Mr. Jeub is going to own everything that's on the site. There will not be people driving RVs onto the site and occupying any of those spaces. As you saw, there isn't what I consider to be an RV on the site today. There's tents, there's shipping containers, there's tiny homes. There's no RVs, there's no wheeled structures coming onto the site. That's not the environment they're trying to create. They're trying to create something different. If people want to do that, there's RV parks all over the county where they can do that. I went over the definition. I think hopefully you understand why this is so broad, and I get the struggle. It's a pretty loose definition. I would condemn your prior staff who probably wrote that before the current staff got here. But I think the reason why it's written that way is because it's intended to try to support this kind of use. I touched on screening. That was one of the comments from the neighbors. That will be implemented, particularly on that north side. We're in agreement with exceptions that I made to the conditions of approval. I touched on the permanent exterior lighting. If that wording could be changed, that would be great because it creates some safety issues for the folks on site. I just want to finish by saying we're talking about 4 sites. We're not talking about, 12 to begin with. We're talking about adding 4 to what's already there, which is 8. And that will help this business continue to grow. It'll help this business be a better neighbor by being able to afford the screening and be able to provide a better road into the property. It's 4 camping sites at the end of the day. I stayed down at John Martin Reservoir over the weekend. Last weekend, I think there's 300 down there. I actually felt pretty spaced out. Kudos to them. But at the end of the day, we're talking about 4 out of when compared to that 300. Hopefully, you look at it from that perspective. He can continue to operate in the business that he has now, but it certainly makes it a lot harder to afford some of the things that are being asked of by the neighbors. With that, I'd be happy to answer any other questions if I haven't already addressed all of them.
Mr. Markowitz, go ahead.
You had one of your slides that actually showed the site plan with where parking is, where the various sites are. There we go. You mentioned that some of the sites, the ones that are generally adjacent to Monument Creek, are going to be tent only. So it looks like 8, 9, 10. Can you describe which ones? Because, I mean, the character of this site is completely different if every one of these had a tent, a large yurt, or even like that small container building that you showed before. And that's a lot different character than if every one of these sites had a fifth wheel. Because the fifth wheel is very, very large.
Understood. I think there's 2 sides of that. And I'll answer your question too. Tents are a lot harder to maintain.
Sure.
Right? And I've seen homeless camps with a lot of tents. I wouldn't necessarily say that was that attractive to look at. If you have hard-sided structures that are more visually appealing, in my opinion, that's a lot more appealing than a whole bunch of tents.
And I guess I'm not really asking about tent versus a permanent structure. I'm mainly focused on the size.
Sure.
Because you had a slide that showed a very small unit that looked like it was a small container converted into that's a lot different than the fifth wheel.
Sure. And honestly, from our perspective, I'm sitting there thinking I could put a much bigger tent than any fifth wheel manufacturer, right? There's huge tents out there. That's not the intent at all, right? So there is a typical that was submitted with the special use. When we do the site development plan, we're going to have to define those exact areas. So if you go outside of that area, and to your point about welding maybe multiple connexes together, we would be outside of that area if it's big enough. Right, and at that point, I think regional building is going to come in and say, look, this has become a permanent dwelling. This is no longer glamping. This is no longer exempt from the regulations. So we are going to have, we've already defined the location. You can see on here, we have setbacks dimensioned from every property line showing that it has to be a minimum of that distance from the property line, no closer, right? This is enforceable. When your code enforcement staff gets a copy of this, if there's a code enforcement complaint, if I'm there, I'm going out with a tape measure saying, how exactly close are you to the property line? And does it comply with the dimension that the applicant got approved for? This document, this plan is enforceable as defined, and then as better defined through the site development plan, the actual pad areas are going to be located and have to be identified to scale.
To scale.
To scale.
Okay. And then the subsequent question would be related to parking. So if you've got 12 sites in here, I think you mentioned that they're going to be limited to 1 family each. Because I can imagine in one of the larger structures, you could have 2 small families and they're all hanging out.
Occupancy is 2, unless it's a family, it's 4.
Okay, and is that listed in the conditions? Is that listed anywhere on the site plan or anything?
I don't know if staff. I'd have to defer staff if they were planning on a condition for that.
I would think that'd be appropriate, especially because if you've got a large, one of the larger units, and you had 2 families of 3. Mm-hmm. Okay, now you got 6 people. You've got 2 SUVs that are going to be needing to park, along with all the other cars that are going to have to park somewhere on this property. I would imagine some of those people that are going to be here will be pulling a boat trailer. because they're out here recreating. So the parking and the amount of the volume of vehicles is important. And if you're limiting it to one family or two people, then that certainly helps mitigate my concern about a couple of families in each unit and having multiple vehicles.
I won't speak for the county attorney, but I suspect she's not going to want to try to limit by the term family. That's a highly litigated term over the course of time. But I think maybe what you're getting at is the number of vehicles. Sure. And you know, we can talk to the client and see if that's an option. I think in terms of enforceability, it's a lot easier to count vehicles than it's going to be to figure out whose family in a certain location.
Sure. And it's the vehicle. It's the how many of these are going to be towing boat trailers with them. I mean, the impact of the vehicles, not necessarily one family or two family, it's the impact of how many vehicles are on the site that are going to impact the neighbors, not only from a site perspective, but just from traffic around the neighborhood.
And there's some space in the property. I'm probably speaking out of turn. I should probably talk to my client, but there's some space in the property that if, you know, somebody was bringing a boat, you know, maybe we provide that overflow parking for trailers or whatever else. I don't think that's very typical, honestly, but I don't think a lot of people come to Colorado to go boating, just lack of water generally. But, you know, if that's something that the Planning Commission would like to see in the site plan, certainly that's something that we could probably add to the site plan pretty easily.
I think it would be a good idea just to CYA.
Yeah, great comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Jack first, Mr. Moraes, Carlson.
We're talking a lot about this fifth wheel and size. That has been there, it looks like, from the beginning, right? So it was the first part of the original approval?
That's correct. And that actually came from a tiny home operation up in Greenmount Falls, or Chipeta Park, excuse me. So that was considered a tiny home by the county, not a RV by the county at that time.
Moraes, go ahead.
I have a few questions. What's the historic occupancy rate has been on this glamping campground annually? Is it 50% of the 8 that are there? Is it on average 50% are occupied, 25% are occupied?
I have to bring my client up. You want to 50%?
About 50% is occupied. Okay, I would say that would probably continue for the future. Next question. Once the site plan is developed, well, let me ask this one first. What's the breakdown currently of those 8 allowed camping facilities?
I'm going to have my client come up and address that and probably maybe answer some other questions that I've heard too.
Hi, I'm Chris Jeub.
How's it going?
Good. You had a question about the...
So the 8 that you currently are there, what would you define? What's the breakdown? And then the 4 that you plan to add,
Yes.
What are you going to define? What are they going to be?
Yes, we have 2 structures that are not tents right now. 3 that have to be tents. Those are the ones down at the creek. Those are 2 bell tents and 1 wall tent. And then we have 3 what we call premium wall tents. And those are large outfitters tents with walls and floors and stuff. 2 of them have bathroom facilities, and then or private ones. And then there's the 2 non-tent structures is the fifth wheel. We got it off of Chipeta Park, and that tiny home village has got a good deal, and I swapped it out thinking that I had the permission to do it. And then the other one is the container home, the pictures that you've seen, which is a 10 by 20 container home converted into.
That's the black. That's the black one with the wood trim.
The black one, yeah.
Okay. So what are the 4 that you want to bring in? What are they going to be?
Yeah, the 3 are on the west side of the property that are up on that clear hill, and those would be something like container homes. Container homes do very well as far as the way the market of glamping goes. glamping it changes very quickly as far as structures and how well the structures do in the market of glamping. And that could be like a cylinder-shaped walled structure. Those are very popular right now. Glass, container home type looking things. There's actually an American Glamping Association trade show up in Arvada every year that have just a huge display. It's quite the hot market. So that's why in this application we want to keep that kind of decision in site development, because then that's when we really pound the stake in the ground, figuratively and literally,
Right.
to really make sure we know what we're putting up. But it's 2 to 4 people. They have one queen size bed in them, and we will inflate a mattress for a kid if they want to be there, and which we've done over the past few years, and that's how it's been rolling, and that's what we would like to continue with 3
So you
with
said
12.
3 of the on the west side container. What's the 4th one going to be?
The 4th one is going to be over by the 3rd safari tent, the one that's very close to the border right now, the border line. That has to be restructured, and we would like to put walled structures there. So we could see 2 container homes right there, and then one of them being the new one, the 12th.
Okay.
I don't have the map in front of me. I think it's like number 9 or something.
So the 4 new structures would be 3 container homes and 1, what you're describing as a safari tent.
Well, it could be. It could be.
What else could it be?
A dome?
Would it be another container home?
It could be another container home.
Okay, let me ask you this. Out of these 12 structures that you just told me, 2, you got a fifth wheel, a container home, 3 tents, 3 premium wall tents, 3, if this gets approved, 3 container homes and 1 safari tent. Would this combination change? Would you go in and take those 3 wall tents that you have right now and make them container homes?
I suppose we would, or could.
And then a 1 safari tent could be a container home, so you could.
Yeah, because safari tents would debilitate over a few years.
Okay.
And if we wanted to swap it out for a container home, yes.
Okay, and then those 3 tents that currently are down by the creek.
8, 9, and 10 are restricted as just tents.
Okay, so in the end, you could have, out of your 12, you could have 9 container homes and 3 tents.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
That's worst case scenario. I mean, that is a scenario
Worst case
that
or
could
best
happen.
case. If those are the best selling ones, that would be best case for you.
Yeah, you're right.
For you. It wouldn't be worst case. Might be worst case for
Yeah,
the
it would be
neighbors.
best case. You're right.
But it would be best case.
I agree.
Best case for you. Okay. And then the site plan, once you submit the site plan, would you deviate from that? Would you come back in and say, oh, now we're going to put container, we want to change these tents to container, and this may be more for, you might have more expertise on this, but would you come back in and say, we need to redo this site plan? Or is this pretty much the site plan given going to be the end result?
So this is where we get into the, like the KOA comparison, right? It's hard to know what your market's going to be tomorrow, probably, let alone 5 or 10 years from now. I think the idea is we want to be able to show pad sites that could be for a tent or could be for a container home, right? Because tents fall apart, or maybe the containers get cost prohibitive and now it needs to be a tent, go back to a tent. There needs to be some flexibility because it's such a developing market right now. And it's just like saying, if somebody wants to put a tent where an RV is supposed to go to KOA, you're going to tell them no. Like you're not going to do that, right? The KOA is going to welcome them. They're going to put their tent up, and everybody's going to go on. But they're restricted to where they're at. And in terms of size and scale, like I said, I think a tent could be just as visually imposing as a container, maybe worse because it's generally one color instead of trying to blend in. So to answer your question, I think the desire for flexibility within that definition, but restricted by the site development plan, is the request, is being able to say we want to be able to respond to the market.
Okay.
It won't change the site development plan in terms of drainage, traffic, lighting, all of that will stay the same. The only difference is, the actual container of humans could be a tent or a container home.
Okay, because I know in the past we've done, I think Rocky Top up on 24, we had a variance of use back in, I don't know, it was probably 21 or something like that. That we had to go and define where those tents were going to be and where the structures were going to be and the RVs were going to be, and
we're totally fine with defining location. It's just the upkeep of tents. I know Chris is highlighting this like I'm sure he would like to. It's harder. I mean, we've all lived in tents. I have tents that I wouldn't stay in again. I mean, it's just what the nature of a tent.
I mean, at a certain point, that's a cost of business.
Yeah, right.
But a structure's the same way. You got to paint it. You got to fix it. It rusts out. I have a house. I mean, my house is nicer than a tent, but I still put a lot of work into keeping my house up.
I hope your house is nicer than a tent.
So, and it's just part of the business. There was a question previously about what was in that. I guess it would be the southwest corner of the property. There was an aerial. It was a white square.
Yeah, that's actually not on this map, but it's on one of the aerial maps, and that's the existing container home.
That's an existing container home.
Yep, that's inside the 25-foot buffer at the moment.
Okay, and that hasn't been moved.
Will be upon approval.
But if it's not approved, you're going to move it?
Yes, I will have to.
Because I guess I'm getting confused.
Am I wrong?
So what Mr. Jeub's trying to say is it meets the setback today, but for the zoning, 25-foot setback. But
it doesn't.
Oh, it doesn't.
Yeah,
okay.
It's a structure.
So that it has to be moved, but it has to be moved in accordance with this plan and the future site development plan.
I mean, we've been working with enforcement on that. It's like this body is going to decide that, and then it'll be moved.
Wait.
It's literally about 10 feet
Okay.
to move it in away from the 25-foot. The owner of the south doesn't have
matter,
a problem with it, but that's the idea. It was set in place 4 years ago, and then that's we haven't moved it yet. No, and code enforcement hasn't required it to be moved.
But
yet.
you know it's within the setback,
Yes, I do.
and you haven't moved it.
No.
Okay.
But there's no. I haven't seen the impact of that.
Well, the impacts.
It's an encroachment into the setback.
Yeah.
So I think the point is working through this process, realizing it has to be moved anyway. Let's make sure we're moving it to the right location. If there's a condition that needs to be complied with.
But if it doesn't get approved,
There's some history to this too. The neighbor to the south is deceased, but we were in partnership with her to do 2 more container homes on her property too. And we were using that area with her permission, so we were kind of in partnership when we were starting this glamping operation. But this is pre-COVID. When we started this. So 2 of the containers, there were actually 3 containers on the south side. 2 of them have been moved. And that has been the talk that we have with code enforcement to actually move it. So I would say, yes, we have moved. We're waiting for a definitive agreement on where we're going to go from here. And that container is going to be moved once this decision is made.
Our job's not code enforcement.
No. I'm just saying that there's.
But that's us working with code enforcement for this. So so I don't want to make it sound like I haven't been working with code enforcement. So 2 of the 3 containers have been moved, but that's kind of ancient history from now.
Okay. Dimensions of there was a condition of use in there that discussed no generators within 200 feet of a property line. You're good with that. I'm guessing there's no opposition to throwing that in there.
Yeah, we don't have any generators now, so.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's all I have for the applicant. I will say to Mr. Dossi, during your presentation, the one thing you said, and I think it may be slightly disingenuous, was hey, Monument is bordering this property. That is true, and we can rezone this to put 17 single-family residential units. You could apply to do that. But if you actually really look at it with the way Monument Creek is and the way you actually can get to that nearest neighbor, it's about a 1.5 mile, according to Google Maps. It's a 1.5 mile drive. So a little bit in terms of yes, in terms of it being a fact, yes, it is right next door. In terms of actually going, would it meet the criteria? Maybe not. So again, that's not for this special use. I'm just part of the presentation. So
I appreciate that comment, but I will tell you that sites that are way harder to develop than this are being developed today. And the reason why is because the availability of extending services, centralized services, is not there in the rural areas. So you're seeing infill projects that have creeks that have to be channelized, bridges that have to be built because that's what's left.
Again, not part of this thing. It was just something that caught my ear.
We could argue about that all day.
Exactly.
After we're done.
Exactly.
Mr. Carlson.
Thank you. On the, in the background that the staff provided, it mentions that there were code enforcement complaints about an RV and about the storage unit. And it said staff informed the applicant that these were not part of a special use approval and could not have the hard-sided structures at the property, and that if they wanted those, they'd have to come through the special use. Are you contending that that's not a correct interpretation of the special use they got to start with?
You're asking me, you're asking Mr. Jeub?
Whoever.
Okay, I'll answer it. Obviously, it's his interpretation because I wasn't involved at the time. I think the definition doesn't preclude that, but what I said, and I'll stick with it, is his previous site plan said tent, right? So it had to comply with that. Under the definition of recreation camp, it clearly allows for all kinds of things. So if you go by the definition, you think, well, I can do whatever's in the definition, then you can bring in a lot of different things. If you go off the site plan, which was prepared as part of their application, it said tent.
Okay.
If I could add, the history of that involves the fifth wheel. That did replace one of my safari tents. There was a premium safari tent there. I ended up through it's kind of a long story, but real short, I got a great deal on that fifth wheel. It was awesome. It was beautiful. It didn't look like an RV, but it was even mistaken as a tiny home, but it is an RV. It's registered RV. And there was just, looking at the site plan that I originally got, the eight units, there was a discussion with staff, and I went ahead and installed it, thinking I had approval. Then the letter of violation came in, and then that was when we had some tense discussions because I had already installed it, and then it was like, oh no, what do we do now? Because it's installed, it's making the same impact as the safari tent that I replaced, but it is now another violation that I thought I was getting out of these violations. So then that triggered this. The addendum that I'm asking for is the non-tent structures to be allowed, and it's a beautiful structure. I think it's actually better than a tent when I look at it. It is large. It's large for an RV, but it is one queen size bed. There's no additional beds. There's no bunks in it. It can fit, it can cram in four. We've had people, mom, dad, 2 kids, they sleep on the couch and a blow-up mattress. There's actually an office in it. And it's got a beautiful deck that overlooks the creek. It's a gorgeous venue. So I'd like to keep it. So that's why we instead of pulling it and replacing it back with a tent, I was like, well, let's go ahead and move forward and try to get permission to keep it here. And that's what's triggering this the RV was the the beginning of this drama, and then it wasn't until after we walked the property with Craig and Nina and really started measuring the impacts of the cost of all of this, especially the screening to the north and Greg and Nina aren't cheap either, but and so these expenses were piling up, and we asked, well, why was 8 even a number for a recreation camp? It really isn't a reason. It could have been 20, could have been 24, but we said, well, let's add a handful more so that it pays for some of this. Because I want to have beautiful structures here. I don't want to have junky structures. And that's, I think the RV is a step up from the tent that we had, and that's my real heart here. I just need to make it fit the whole of the county and get it working.
Thank you.
Mr. Carlson, I also, we talked through this with staff too. A lot of the way that this site has been treated is more akin to a variance of use that you all see all the time, right? Where you nail down exactly the use, regulate it to the nth degree because it's an exception to the zoning, right? That's what a variance is. You're asking for something in addition to the bucket of uses that you get on your existing zoning. That's not the case here. This is a special use. When the county identifies uses as a special use, that's the county saying, generally, this use is okay, but for the need to mitigate some of the impacts, right? So nailing it down to how you label a site as tent or hard-sided structure, that's not typical with the special use. You're blessing the use because it's already been accepted by the county as a use that can generally be compatible. That goes back to the compatibility discussion. It's a use that's generally seen as compatible with the underlying uses, the other allowed uses. A variance of use is something that's an exception. This is not an exception. This is something the county has said, this should go in this zone, as long as they mitigate their visual impacts, their lighting, their traffic, their drainage, their wastewater, their water, which is what they've done.
Does the application, I don't see it here in your letter, I may have missed it, but does it ask for the ability to do hard-sided structures? Or are you just going with, hey, it's allowed already under the definition?
Yeah, I mean, we're going with the definition of recreation camp because of the special use discussion, right? The special use is recreation camp. It's not recreation camp except you don't get X, Y, and Z. You apply for the special use based upon the use table that's in the land development code and the definition that's in chapter 1 of the land development code. And if you're in compliance with that, then you're in compliance with your approval.
Okay, great. I've got questions for staff, but I'll wait till after.
Okay. Ms. Fuller, Mr. Byers, back to Mr. Smith.
Okay, I want to establish right now we have a residential zoned property with an administrative approval for 8 tent sites based on that plan. So I don't want us to go to this, that includes hard-sided things. I want this to be very clear to everyone here, what is currently approved and what is being asked for. So it's not just 4 more sites, it's what's approved now is 4 tents and 4 shared bathrooms, and it sounds like we have at least 2 hard-sided things with their own bathrooms. Is that correct?
For the record, that was correct. I just didn't get on the microphone.
Do each of these sites have their own electricity?
The 3 tents of the 3 tents, 2 of them do not. They're solar powered.
There's eight sites. How many of them have their own electricity?
6.
So that's the generator thing.
It's not a generator though.
I know they're not. That's why they don't need a generator because they have electricity. The tents wear out. To me, I believe that when this was approved, the neighbors kind of let it go because it was tents, and they're like, not that bad. It's just going to be the summer. We're not going to have year-round living here. So I think that it was very intentional to approve tents. When we're talking about this is really a different use variance than what is approved. And I think that we should just be honest brokers on what's happening here. I agree with Mr. Moraes on the 17 lots. Like there are, costs to all that. So that does not ring true with me. The sites, I guess the site plan, if this were to be approved by the commissioners, you have these tent sites that are right on the creek, and like how close is that bathroom versus them using, the glorious outdoors right next to Monument Creek that is my water. Let's see. So we've addressed that. So, and with those 8 yurts, it's like, that's a summer use. So we're not talking, in Monument. So you're talking 4 or 5 months. And so this is different than the hard-sided ones as well. And so I guess I'm not seeing the compatibility of, short-term summer camping versus these longer-term, like you could probably live in one of these in the winter. The other thing is that, the first variance was requested after a code enforcement violation. The agreement was tents. Then you came in and had hard-sided things, another code violation. So this seems like I'd like an explanation of why are we doing something and then asking for forgiveness? And, we hear this a lot. I had no idea. Well, you know that you're already trickling on some prickly territory. So to not ask permission, that I want to know, if this were to be approved, what would keep you from adding the 13th or 14th or 15th to protect these neighbors, and who's going to enforce 30 days? Like, you've proven right now, like, you're not really a person that honors the agreement.
Well. Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. That was good. The nature of glamping is going to be difficult. And that's why I'm here trying to fit into the county's recreation camp definition. So yeah, that's I guess that's my answer. The structure is intended to provide an outdoor or semi-outdoor experience for my guests. And that's what I'm trying to fulfill. And so the code violation, I've kind of explained the history of it and how it's doing it. I feel like we are really close to 100% compliance. But that's just going to have to be from this body to make sure I fit in there.
Okay, but this is residential and it's like a special use. So you're asking for special rights that the neighbors don't have. So it's like, we just want to be sensitive to, you have neighbors that they don't have tents and stuff on their property, and they were generous to, not pitch a fit over this. So I'm going to say, I may have more questions later, but I'm going to stop for now.
Mr. Chair, and I'm not going to debate anything Ms. Fuller said. She mentioned that there was a variance approved before. It was not. It was a special use. This is also a special. There is a significant difference between the two.
Mr. Byers. Okay. Mr. Dossi, I believe you were running this department when this original application came for the special use in 2022?
I was not.
Or not, okay.
This approval was rendered by a different person.
Okay, but was the original application for special use, when was that applied for? It was in 2022?
2022. I think it was January 2022.
Do you have any idea what criteria was used? Because it was an administrative approval. So I don't believe the public had much, if any, input into that at that time.
So the public is given notice of that application, just wearing a former hat. If the public objects to it, then it gets elevated to public hearing. So if there's no objection, that's all special uses, not just this one. It's all special uses with a few exceptions. If there's opposition, it gets elevated to this body and the Board of County Commissioners.
Okay.
And frankly, when we did that in the code, there was a lot of special uses that were going to hearing that didn't need to be going to hearing because nobody cared. So it's the board's way of saying, if somebody does care, let's put it to public hearing, which is why we're here today, because people are caring. But they allowed that administrative process.
In the vein of compatibility, what property and what proximity would a similar use be to this property?
Hopefully not nearby. I mean, that would represent
well, so
competition.
if you're arguing that there's good compatibility,
yeah.
Then it would stand to reason that at some point you would have a similar use where would we find the closest similar use?
I don't live in the area. I don't know where the nearest, I guess it'd probably be a campground. I mean, glamping, the nearest glamping is his other site, which I think they're maybe the only two in the county. So in terms of like campgrounds, I mean, you have the forest. I mean, you could have anybody living in a tent on their own property, right? So it's something like that could be happening today.
Okay, but we wouldn't call that glamping.
Yeah, and overnight accommodations, the town of Monument.
Which would probably be on a property that is zoned for that use?
Yeah, I mean, it could be a special use. A lot of times hotels are special uses.
Is there a reason why this application, other than staff recommendation, that you wouldn't want to try and just completely legitimize it by a rezone application?
Honestly, I'll wear the county hat for a second. If you rezone this to commercial, then you're bringing with it a bucket of land uses that are allowed uses that definitely would not be compatible with anything around it. If you look at the allowed uses in CC, CR, CS, it brings with it sexually oriented businesses. It brings with it drug and alcohol rehab facilities. those are things that are definitely not compatible with this neighborhood. So to ask for a special use within residential zoning, I think that's why the county set it up that way, right? Is if you want to have something that's not residential, then you need to go through this special process to make sure you've addressed your impacts. If you rezone to commercial, it opens it up to a whole list of things, most of which are allowed uses. They don't require coming to this board at all. Drug and alcohol rehab and sexual-oriented businesses are allowed. You can go out, get your site development plan administratively and do that tomorrow. That doesn't afford this venue, this process at all. So to go through a rezoning, frankly, kind of opens up Pandora's box, worst case scenario for these folks and anybody else who moves into this area of what could come next. That you don't get that with the special use.
To be honest, we did discuss it. I mean, a rezoning would be an option to do a glamping operation, but that's not really what we want. I mean, we aren't trying to build an RV park or a campground. It's a glamping operation. We own the units.
I
We
think
own
if you
the
look at the site plan, it feels like a campground.
Yep.
right.
Yeah. So you are trying to build a campground.
It feels like it, but I don't agree that it needs to be rezoned. It can be a recreation camp. So.
Okay.
Well,
One other quick question, and then we'll let somebody else. The infrastructure. So the electrical that is servicing the hard buildings, is that from a generator or is it hardwired?
It's hardwired.
And due to the seemingly willingness to violate code, did that go through some process to hardwire buildings?
Yes. Yeah. We had a professional electrician install
Did that get taken to RBD?
Yes. Yeah. He's a certified electrician. I can get you the name and details if you need to.
Because it feels, yeah, and the reason is because if it was not done per code.
It was done per code. Yes.
We don't want to introduce fire hazard in this particular
absolutely.
location.
Neither do I. Yeah. And that's, I forget what they call it, but he installed it right on my property. And then the trenches have been installed. That was last winter.
Okay, because I know when I
last winter.
My barn,
Yeah.
I had to get a permit to do so.
Yep.
And I don't see that this is a heck of a lot different than that.
So regional
not, really.
regional building, and we went through this when we did the tiny home regulations. Regional building will not permit anything inside, right? They permit the connection, the electrical connection, but because it's not a structure under their regulations, they won't touch it inside. That's up to the homeowner.
Right.
It's that connection, that the permitting of the actual trenching and the connection into the unit.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Smith, did you still have a question?
I don't know that I do anymore. We've been playing games with semantics a lot, and words really matter. And we've used the word, you guys have used the word RV, tiny home, and one other word, all to cover that one facility. And now what I think I just heard was that when you brought electricity to it, they considered it a tiny home, and therefore all they cared about was bringing the electricity to where it's the junction. They don't care about what's inside.
I would say it's similar.
Okay, so that answers my question, because we get hung up with the square footage. What's a tiny home versus an RV? You know, is an RV a tiny home when you take the wheels off of it? I mean, this thing looks like a split entry, I could live there kind of place. It's so pretty. So I guess the answer is they've already come out and said, this is, you do what you do and we're good.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You're tracking. That's all I can tell you. I apologize for using different language, but in kind of the regulatory world, they are kind of used synonymously and interchangeably, because I think a lot of people say tiny home, tiny home, tiny home. Tiny home's typically on wheels, has axles, but it's not a permanent structure, just like these are not permanent structures under the building code. So you're tracking perfectly.
Okay. That was my confusion. Thank you.
Come to Mr. Whitney in a minute. I hesitate, I guess, to opine that a lot of this stuff that we've just gone off, kind of on a little bit of a tangent, is any of these sites, even a tent site, could have an electrical hookup next to it, and that's, those that are installed are permitted and the rules are followed. And whether it's just a place that you can plug in, your phone charger versus connecting into something that powers it, a larger structure really doesn't matter. And it kind of goes back to the fundamental issue here is that what we're looking at is a number of sites and a number that are allowed for this use. And ultimately, I guess in my mind, that's the question that we're asking, and the addition of 4 more sites onto what's already approved is the fundamental question that I think we're trying to address. Yeah. Mr. Whitney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually building on your comments, Mr. Jeub, a few minutes ago, you made an interesting comment, and I think it's really at the heart of what we're doing. When you were explaining the original special use, you said, all of a sudden we realized what's the magic of 8? It could have been 20. And that presumes that the 20 would have been approved. And that's exactly what the problem is. 8 was approved. You're assuming that 20 could have been approved. I'm not so sure I share that opinion for the reasons that the chair mentioned.
Right. And Mr. Whitney, I think maybe Mr. Jeub was referring to the definition. The definition of recreation camp doesn't limit the number of spaces or number of structures or tents.
I understand, but it had to meet, it was approved administratively because in the eyes of the staff.
That's correct.
It met all the criteria, assuming in particular a compatibility requirement.
Yeah.
20 might have resulted in a totally different decision than 8. That's all I'm suggesting. And I'm agreeing with the chair that that's
completely agree with that. Thank you. I agree. It was what was approved, but the definition doesn't limit it. That's all I'm saying. It's just.
Now we have the question of the number, and so that's what we'll deal with today. Mr. Markowitz.
Just to make sure I'm clear, the special use that we've got right now is for tents. Is that's the way the special use was written, correct?
I will say that that's the interpretation of staff.
Okay. All right. So we are fundamentally changing that use and documenting that hard-sided buildings, the connexes, the RVs or the fifth wheels, we're basically solidifying that if this passes. So there is an additional difference, just not in number of sites, but what is allowed on the sites. My biggest concern is the impact of if you've got 3 sites that are restricted, okay, because they're so close to the creek, that leaves 9, okay? My biggest concern, if I was a neighbor, is that you put 9 fifth wheels on there at some point. Okay, so I've got a 20-foot RV. When I'm driving that down the road and I pass a 45-foot fifth wheel, it is a world of difference. It's not only taller, it's longer, and then there's also the possibility of the extensions. So, I mean, if you took another fifth wheel, put it on there, put all the sides out and all the ramps and all the things you can do with these real fancy, that's a huge impact compared to a 20-foot Connex. So my question is, would you be comfortable with a note or a condition on this approval that those structures will be limited to the 20-foot connexes converted into these camping sites versus anything larger than that? Would that be an acceptable condition? Because I can't speak for the neighbors. If I were one of them, I think that would be a fair compromise in my mind. But I mean, you obviously are going to have to accept that or not, and the board will obviously have to agree to put that into the motion. But
I would say they don't have to decide right now. They can think about it.
I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, everything's on the table, really. We're making a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. That could be a recommendation. And by then, we'll probably have thought through everything. We could get together with neighbors and see if that's a nice compromise. And by the time the commissioners hear it, whether or not you approve this, that could be a discussion point that could leverage their decision.
Okay, and I'm not going to be voting on this today, so it's going to be up to my fellow commissioners to put that in the motions or whatever. But I think that is a good compromise that, as a good neighbor, you should strongly consider.
Well, and I think that I agree with that. I think it's a great recommendation, but it also sort of limits the type of thing you can have on the site, right? And I think maybe that's what you're getting at a little bit too.
Some sort of limitation.
Sure. Yeah.
I'd just like to say, for the record, I'm open to that kind of limitation. How we define that is kind of up in the air. The real heart of this is the 4 extra units is paying for already litigation, or not litigation, but mitigation for screening and things like that to make this happen for the neighbors. So yeah, I'm open to more discussions on and narrowing that down or tuning it in.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the applicant from the commissioners? Well,
Maybe.
Yeah, there will be another, you'll be back up here at some point. But I'm trying to be conscious of people's time and a need for another break here. I think, thank you, Mr. Dossi. Mr. Jeub, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
We'll move on now, and what I'm going to suggest, I think, is many of the neighbors in opposition have an attorney that's going to take some of their time, and so I'm thinking perhaps we bring that up, open the public comment period, start with that for 20-ish minutes, we think, maybe. Yeah, and then take another break and possibly get some lunch at that point. But I hesitate to stop us right now. If welcome comments and input from my fellow commissioners.
As I alluded to, I've got a question for staff, if I might, before we go into that presentation. Is that all right?
Okay. Yeah.
Great. So, as I said earlier, it appears that there's a difference in interpretation between the applicant and staff, and so I wanted to get an idea on who reviewed it administratively and what was the intent of the approval. It sounded like there was a meeting with neighbors, complaints, whatever, and then something was satisfied to them, and then it could be approved administratively. And it seems like that approval was based on tents only. And so I'd like to get the input or confirmation of that from staff, if I could.
Yes. This project was approved administratively, and it specifically depicts the site plan showing the 8 tents and the 4 shared bathrooms. That is what was approved. It was approved administratively we did receive opposition. When I glanced at the project, I saw 5 letters of opposition. There was a neighborhood meeting, and then whatever happened at that neighborhood meeting, I'm not aware of. However, they did withdraw their opposition after that neighborhood meeting, and that's when previous staff made the decision, now we don't have opposition, we can approve this administratively.
And that was based on that plan showing all tents?
Yes.
Okay.
It is clearly depicted that it is 8 tents and 4
So
shared
now I have a
bathrooms.
question for the county attorney. Does that follow that the approval is based on just tents, or because the special use was approved, it goes into this general definition of whatever flies under special use? The applicant's contending that they can put anything on there based on the special use. The plan showed just tents, which seems to be the intent of what was agreed to.
Before I answer that, Mr. Carlson, I'd like an opportunity to review the approval myself. I'm sure that Ms. Mavey is representing it correctly, but I would want to look at the entire thing before I gave you an opinion.
And I'm going to give you a planning answer as well. I mean, In the planning function, there's a definition of a use, and that use is a permitted use in some zones and a special use in other zones. And the special use is, that process is to determine, is it compatible? Does the use work at this specific location, regardless of what the location is? And that's why we go through this process. That's why we have notes on the site plan, notes on the site development plan, and you as a board, as well as administratively on special uses, we place conditions on those uses. And so while Lori is giving you the legal answer, I can't imagine that this staff that approved it administratively was thinking, hey, we're going to label this as tents, but we really don't mean tents. The site plan was approved for 8 because that was the depth of the approval under the definition that they felt was appropriate for this specific location. And that's, in my mind, as a planner, how these special use processes work. But then I'll let Laura give her legal opinion, which I can't imagine is going to be too much different, but let's see.
Well, and I think we can come back to that at some point later. It'll be this afternoon. But as you look for that, Mr. Whitney, you had something else.
Mr. Chair, sorry, just for the record, I appreciate the clarification because I'm troubled by the comment of that was the staff's interpretation. I'm sure the staff wasn't pulling that out of the air. There were 8 tent sites that were subject to the special use. It's not a matter of interpretation. That's what the application was for, and that's what they ruled on. So I'm troubled by the suggestion that, well, that's the staff's interpretation. So for the record, I don't like that a bit.
Well, I think that I assume that means there's collaboration, as you know, with all of this, from an early application or early engagement meeting on through the process. There's a dialogue between the staff and the applicant that covers things like, should we rezone? Should we go for special use? There's a lot of back and forth that goes there, and judgment is applied throughout. That's what we pay the staff for, is to apply their judgment. And at some point, they cross a threshold at which they submit things to us, and we apply our judgment, and we recommend things to the guys that actually make the decision, which is the Board of County Commissioners, and they apply their judgment at a different level. So any other questions for staff? And I guess, is there just a kind of a quick up or down head nod or shake if we press on for another 20-ish minutes? We going to be okay with that? Okay, let's press ahead. And I'm sorry, Ms. Segal.
Thank you. So I was able to pull up the file for the past approval. The approval letter, as a condition approval, specifically states, approval is limited to the recreation camp as discussed and depicted in the applicant's letter of intent and site plan drawings. And the site plan lists all 8 sites as tents as far as I can see. So that approval was for 8 tents, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Harrington, you get
No,
your
I
finger
was
on the
just going
button.
to say, I was like crossing my fingers. No, that tracks with my understanding. I was not the director at the time. That was the interim director, but that tracks with what I understand from that director, as well as the staff that staffed that application, is that there was conversations with the neighbors and staff, what was compatible in this specific location related to the conditions of approval, which apply when we're making an administrative determination as well. And that was the, compatible amount of sites and the type of sites that were agreed upon related to that process at the time.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Trowbridge.
In reviewing the land development code, to second what Ms. Seco just said, it does say that special uses are limited to what is in the approved special use. So that would bolster, it's just tents, it's 8 tents. Period.
And like everything else that we see here, it's what does the applicant ask us for to begin with? And at that point, the request was for 8 tent sites. whether we define tent sites, how we define tent sites may have been left up in the air, but now we have a slightly different application that clarifies not all are tents, but some will be more hard-sided structures. Anything else? Yeah, we don't have a definition of a tent in the code, right?
I really need like a 3-minute break. Just really fast.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to agree with that. Well, let's break for about 5, do what we have to do, then we'll come back and open for public comment.
5 minutes?
No, we're not going to stop for lunch at this point because we have too many people here. So 5 to 10 minutes. Let's get everybody cycled through as quickly as we can. Jay, you're first. If I could have your attention. No, I got it. If I could have your attention, please. No. All right, you made me use the hammer. Sorry. Hate to do that. We do want to move this along, and I am very conscious of all of your time, so we're going to try to press ahead here. I'd like to get through this item in the next 45 minutes or so. But at the same time, I don't want anybody to feel like we've rushed. I'm told that there's counsel to represent most of or many of the neighbors who are here in opposition. I've agreed to let him take, as I keep saying, 20-ish minutes. That's essentially taking the time of 8-10 of you to speak on your behalf. So as long as I don't have a whole bunch of other people come up to try to, repeat what he's already said or add on to it, I'm going to allow that. I will still give a little bit of my normal as sir, you want to come on up and start getting closer so that we don't have to wait too long. But I try to remind people that it's the quality of your comments that are more important than the quantity. So having 10 people come up and say the same thing, we've heard it, we've read it. We read, 62 pages of letters in opposition already. So we're very well aware of the issues and the concerns that you all have. And so I will stop at that. Normally, we ask first if there's anybody in the audience who would like to speak in favor of this application. I don't see anyone, so we'll now move on to public comments in opposition to this application. And
Mr. Chair, we have the approval criteria put up on the screen.
yeah, thank you. While you're introducing yourself, we'll get the approval criteria back up here. Thank you. Because again, the reminder for the audience, these are the only things that matter to us. We understand the emotion and, that also factors in for many, but as far as we're concerned, we're bound to consider the specific criteria. And I do appreciate the applicant's presentation that, focused on those things, because that helps us all in the long run. So without further ado, sir, please go ahead.
Thank you.
And for the record, introduce yourself.
I will.
Sign in there. And
my name is Chris Macheski. I'm an attorney with Robinson and Henry. I am here representing approximately 20 or so of the neighbors surrounding this proposed and continued special use permit. And a lot of the comments I had to make, you have already addressed in your questions. I believe, Ms. Fuller, you stole my thunder with forgiveness versus permission. And I mean, that's the issue I think many of the neighbors who are here in opposition have with this proposed revision of the special use permit. So I don't want to harp on that, and I want to try and address the elements that that you all are looking at. But I think it's important to look also at the history and what has happened here thus far, and why there are so many people here now opposing this proposed change to the special use permit. And that has a lot to do with what you've asked about so far today, that this was originally approved as 8 tent sites. And with the proposition to the neighbors that this would be an unobtrusive use and addition to the neighborhood. And that's just not how it's been. And unfortunately, Mr. Jeub's conciliation and remorse that he's shown today with respect to his ongoing code violations is starkly in contrast to his comments to neighbors, his comments on social media, his comments in his YouTube videos that have been referenced in a number of the letters in opposition. I hope some of you have had a chance to look at, because I think those are instructive on Mr. Jeub's respect for all of you and the county government, who is attempting to enforce these regulations that you've put in place for the benefit of all of the citizens, including the folks I represent here today. I took a look last night at Mr. Jeub's website for Monument Glamping, just to get an idea of what's he saying in his advertisements. You know, he's coming in today and saying, well, I'm asking for permission to do certain things that I've been doing on this site for more than 2 years. And he's talking about asking for permission for the big red RV or tiny home or whatever it is under the definitions in the applicable regulations while he's renting it. He's asking for permission for the hard-sided container home while he's renting it, and has been. They're up for rent on his site right now. He talked about none of the sites have an occupancy over 4. Well, at least one of them I looked at had a tent site with a queen bed and bunk beds that said it was occupancy up to 6. Presumably that would be a family, maybe adults and 4 children, but it's just a misrepresentation of reality, the promises versus the reality. And so I counted up, looking at the current 8 sites he has listed on his website, the total accommodation would be, if they were all occupied to their maximum occupancy, would be 28 guests. Assuming 4, that's about 3.5 guests per site. Assuming 4 more sites, he's talking about maximum occupancy of 4 guests per site. So we can up that, I think, to 44 guests with what he's proposing. And it's clear they're asking for approval, open-ended approval, as to what they can do under this special use permit. And they said, okay, we're going to have 3 tent sites because we're only allowed 3 tent sites in the flood zone next to the creek. But I think the expectation is the other 9 will be hard-sided structures. And suddenly this goes from a seasonal glamping operation or camping operation to potentially a year-round use. And we're talking about transitional business. Well, this is a neighborhood of large lots, mostly 5-acre lots, and you can look over here at the folks who occupy them. Well, some of them have small businesses on their properties. One has a small organic farm. Another one up the road who actually spoke in support has a hobby farm with a pumpkin patch and a petting zoo, it looks like, and some fruit orchards. Well, those are not year-round operations, nor are they 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operations like this that Mr. Jeub is proposing. He's not asking for any limitations on his ability to operate these hard-sided sites 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, potentially. I mean, there aren't a lot of people who are going to want to sleep in a tent when it's snow and blow and everything else we get here in the wintertime in Colorado. But if you have a hard-sided structure, that's a different story. I've stayed in the KOA cabins with a K, I think they call them, in their campgrounds. They're quite cozy, regardless of the weather. So they tend to be the first to be occupied as well, and they tend to be fully booked as well. And so the statements about 50% occupancy, I think if we go to 9 hard-sided structures, you're going to see presumably 75% occupancy and up. So that figure I gave of potentially 40 plus guests a night is not beyond the realm of possibility. And again, that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Presumably there will be more occupancy on weekends, but I think based on the comments you've heard and seen in the letters of opposition, this is not a small operation as it is. And he's looking to expand it by at least 50%. And again, the expansion to hard-sided structures is going to be a significant change from 8 approved tent sites. So just to take a look back at the, and just to back that up, if you look at the April 8th, 2024 site plan responses to the staff comments, the responses to the requests that many of you made today for clarification on what types of structures would be on these sites, the response was the type of structures will not be included, as the nature of a recreation camp is that the structures are temporary. And a note has been added to reflect this. And that was the response to the staff's request for clarification. Obviously, when Mr. Jeub stood before you today, you pinned him down a little harder on that. And I think it was clear from his answer that you're going to have 9 hard-sided structures, at least the size of the 10 by 20 container home and possibly the size of the much larger red RV/tiny home. And that is what these neighbors are going to be dealing with, is the occupancy of those structures. Is that compatible with the neighborhood? Well, Mr. Jeub's representative says, well, we're looking at a transitional property because we have tract homes going up just to the east, and this is a good transition from those high-density tract homes over to the low-density 5-acre plus lots in the Pine Hills neighborhood. But I think it's informative to look at what was the intended character of this neighborhood, to look at the restrictive covenant that was put in place back in, I believe it was 1957 when this neighborhood was established. And although that's not binding in any way upon you today, it certainly is informative to what the intention was when this neighborhood was set up. Obviously, things change in 70 years around here or less. They change overnight. But the question being, well, if this is a transitional property in a transitional neighborhood, well, where does it stop? Where do you draw the line? And again, a small business on your property that involves an organic farm or pumpkin patch or pick your own fruit is one thing for this type of neighborhood and this particular neighborhood, but a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day operation is quite another. And that's what they're proposing. Much as they would like you to think, well, it's a recreation camp. Well, again, the definition is vague. And Mr. Jeub, if you've watched his online videos, his approach is to use that vagueness in the law to slip between the lines and say, well, you know, I submitted my application, but I forgot to hit submit on the button, is what he said in one of his videos. I thought I had approval to put these hard-sided structures on my property, but I didn't. Well, and then code enforcement showed up at my door. What do? Well, apparently you don't do anything. You just keep doing what you're doing until someone comes and physically shuts you down. And until now, the county has not done that. Instead, they've said, well, submit an application for what you're actually doing and see if you can get that approved. Well, the container home's been on the property, I think Mr. Jeub said, for 4 years. That's before he had his original permit. And the intent was to expand onto the neighbor's property. Well, there's no indication there was any application for permit of that either. The big red RV was moved on without permission, without specifically going back and asking. He submitted the site plan. He knew that it was 8 tenths. He knew what it was approved for. So for him to stand up here and say otherwise is rather disingenuous. But I want to address the factors you've talked about and emphasize that a special use permit is discretionary. And that means that although this is allowed, it's not necessary for you to approve it. And certainly you can even revoke it if the applicant and the special permit use holder is not conforming with their approved uses. And in this situation, obviously Mr. Jeub has not been for multiple years, even before he got his original permit. And so as far as special use, yes, you can all recommend to the Board of Commissioners that this is something we think is appropriate for this property. But the neighbors here are kind of in the fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me. So they're here standing up. They're not withdrawing their opposition. I've spoken with a couple of folks today who said, well, we never withdrew our opposition to the first permit request. So the idea that it went through the administrative process and approval may not be quite correct, because there were at least one or two who continued with their opposition, although some did withdraw their opposition. So looking at the elements you've talked about, again, is this an appropriate transitional use for this property? Well, I think the demonstration from the other compatible uses around the neighborhood of people operating home businesses is clearly it's not. Again, if someone wants to operate a small farm, if you want to have a riding stable or a arena where you have folks come in during the day and ride horses on your property in a arena or a outdoor riding center, that's one thing. You know, that's an agricultural use or agricultural related use that the original founders of this neighborhood provided for in their covenants. What they did say, though, the original covenant drafters, was that we want the structures, the occupied structures on the property, to be a minimum of 1,100 square feet. And we also prohibit temporary structures or temporary occupancy structures, whether they be tents or other smaller structures. The intent was to have single-family use on a property. Now, Mr. Jeub has a rather large family, I understand, so single-family use on his property, I think he could argue, would require several structures, but that's not what's covered in the special use permit. And it's certainly not what's provided for in the covenant that is recorded against this neighborhood. Again, although that is instructive, obviously it's not binding upon all of you because it's a contractual covenant. It is still binding upon Mr. Jeub with respect to his neighbors, but he's obviously taken another approach to that. So with respect to the elements we've seen thus far, I think the staff's comments and analysis are particularly informative, and I won't go through them in detail again because all of you asked I think, what are the relevant questions? And the relevant concerns that have been raised already by the folks sitting behind me here in opposition to this modification. There are a couple of things I did want to touch upon, however, and some of it had to do with, again, what is an appropriate transitional use? And again, the neighbors here, I think in the spirit of compromise, many of them withdrew their oppositions to the 8 tent sites, but not all. This is a considerably different proposal. Mr. Jeub will stand up here and say, well, it's only 4 more sites. Well, again, if you're going from camping tents with approximately 50% occupancy is what he says, to hard-sided structures, I think we know that it's going to be a considerably more impactful use. And I don't want to say he's deliberately evasive in his application, because it does conform with the letter of the permit process for a special use permit. But I think it's fair for all of you to ask for additional detail and additional confirmation of what is your real intended use for this property. The analysis as to the staff's comments, one of the comments they made was this may not be compatible with the rural character of the neighborhood. And I think we can demonstrate that it clearly is not. 9 hard-sided, year-round, potentially occupied structures with up to 30-day occupancy. I mean, I could foresee in the off-season that Mr. Jeub, to generate revenue and to keep his facilities occupied, could offer weekly or monthly rates. And what is the process of monitoring that? Well, you're going to rely on Mr. Jeub to self-report unless someone is sitting watching and looking at license plates and cars and things like that to say, well, this vehicle's been on the property for more than 30 days, or this vehicle's been on the property for 60 to 90 days. Well, I don't think the applicant's prior history fosters that kind of trust from all of you that he will do what is right and what is in conformance with the permission he's been granted. Also, I'd like to talk about the urban and commercial creep into this rural environment. Obviously, there are residential homes on the other side of the creek. Well, those are tract homes. They're on small lots, planned unit development. There's going to be more apparently to the south. The creek provides a good buffer, and that provides a good transition from one neighborhood to another. And saying that we need a campground, a commercial campground with a dozen units on it as a transition from homes to homes on small lots to homes on bigger lots is not, in my opinion, an appropriate transition. And I don't think the factors listed here support that either. The staff comments also commented about they thought that the development is expected to generate approximately 32 daily trips to the surrounding road network. And Mr. Jeub's representative said, well, you know, with the addition of more roads, he said something about background traffic. I didn't quite understand that, because the only way in and out of Mr. Jeub's property is from Rickenbacker. So there will be traffic for potentially 12 occupied sites. Again, the questions were good. Are those 1 vehicle sites? Are they 2 vehicle sites? Maybe not everybody pulls a boat when they come in, but there are a heck of a lot of folks in Colorado who like ATVs and motorcycles. And I do myself. I motorcycle camp. And when I go to a campground, sometimes I get up very early in the morning to go out on a ride. Well, fortunately, my campgrounds aren't located in residential neighborhoods. So when I fire up my motorcycle at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning to head to Denny's for breakfast, that doesn't disturb anybody else except the neighbors in my campground who've been opening and closing their doors all night long to get in and out of their car because they forgot their flashlight or their sleeping pillow, or they need another blanket, or who knows what the case may be. The other issues that were raised were the tent sites along the creek. Mr. Jeub currently, according to his website, has them equipped with Cabela commodes, which are essentially a 5-gallon bucket with a plastic bag and a chair over the top of it. Well, I don't know if any of you have been camping, but sometimes it's easier to walk out of the tent in the middle of the night and whatever's right outside the tent, let her rip instead of walking up to the stinky outhouse or going into the stinky commode. Speaking for camping with my wife, I know she would rather squat in the grass than going into an outhouse any day of the week. So the reality here is, Ms. Fuller's comment about that's my drinking water, it's a legitimate concern. Water usage, we talked about, Mr. Jeub's representative talked about water usage. He has the appropriate water rights. Again, if we're talking about 9 hard-sided structures with inside plumbing, with the red house, according to the website, has a sink, a kitchenette, a dishwasher. The container home has a kitchenette in it, flush toilets, sinks. So we're talking about considerable use. How that will affect the surrounding neighbors who also use wells, we don't know right now. But it is certainly a concern for my clients who live nearby.
Mr. Macheski, I'm gonna ask you to
wrap it up
a little bit. You've repeated a lot of things that we've already heard.
Sure.
Which is, again, goes to the quantity of the argument, not the quality. But if you have a couple other points you'd like to make, I'm still willing to give you some more time.
Sure. One thing I would like to address is some of the things you raised that maybe you didn't go far enough. The tent situation. Mr. Jeub said the 3 tents along the creek are solar powered, so we're not dealing with generators there. The new hard-sided structures, he said, would be hardwired to the electrical for his property. Well, container homes have a different requirement for comfort levels than a tent does. I know, looking at the pictures on Mr. Jeub's website, the big red RV has what appears to be either an external air conditioner or swamp cooler. He advertises for heat, propane heaters, which, again, on container homes and RVs tend to make noise. Anybody who's stayed in a campground or a commercial campground, particularly on a cold night, knows, particularly a guy like me who sleeps in a tent, knows that you hear heaters, you hear swamp coolers or whatever the RVs have to provide comfort to the occupants. So with respect to the comments, I think all of you have asked the appropriate questions, but the answers here have just raised more concerns, frankly, than the original application, because the original application, I think, was deliberately vague to try and comply with these requirements. And this proposed use simply does not. And frankly, your discretion allows you to look at Mr. Jeub's past behavior with respect to his current permit and say, well, maybe you haven't earned the right to keep that use because you violated it from the start. And frankly, my clients would like to see this operation either curtailed or shut down, but at least brought into compliance with what he is supposed to do and put some strict requirements on enforcement, enforceability, and accountability for this operation. And I know one of the folks here with me, Mr. Phillips, I think he had some short comments of his own. So I've spoken for about 25, but I think he has a few words he'd like to say.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Macheski. Yes, I was going to ask if there are any other comments. We'll give you a couple minutes. Again, the less repetition, the better, but
yes, sir.
The floor is yours, Mr.
Duly
Phillips.
noted. So I want to fill in a piece of this.
Again, identify yourself for the record and make sure you're signed in.
Yeah. It's Stephen Phillips. My wife and I have lived at 2620 Spats Road for 24 years, and we consider this our community and our final home, so to speak. And to give a little bit of insight into the process with the original application, I was told by Chris when I went and talked to him that it was going to be 5 or 6 tents. That's what he was going to ask for. The Geigleys were told the same thing. Another resident was told 6/10. And that's why I said to Chris, I don't agree with you on this. I'm not going to oppose you, and I'm certainly not going to support you. I do not believe this is good for the community, not for our neighborhood. Then the next thing we see, it was actually 8/10. So we went from 5 to 6 to 8, just like that. And then immediately, and I've read all of the documentation, there's no ambiguity. There's nothing that's any way ambiguous about 8/10 sites can include anything else. There's no ambiguity in that. So when I went and talked to Chris about the secondary application, and he actually had another guy with him, we talked about this. And I said, Chris, I'm going to reiterate all of my concerns, but now they're even heightened. So I didn't submit anything in opposition, but I have on this one. Because he clearly said, now this was interesting. If you watch the December video of Chris addressing the neighborhood, it was 2 neighbors, he said, relative to my letter of opposition, which was that I opposed the 12 sites definitively, he looked in the camera and said, Steve, you're wrong. There's not going to be any more than 8 sites. That is on the video, readily available, and this has been a consistent pattern, and it has demonstrated increasing concern. This is why we're here. This is why we're all here, because there's this pattern of behavior. In fact, here's the more exhaustive I got via Cora request about all the violations and non-compliance stuff. Here are 2 additional properties that Chris is associated with, separate notices of violation in April of 2023. Is he again claiming ignorance? My final inquiry was with Pikes Peak Regional Building Department. Called them up and asked them if there been any issues, and she said, oh yeah, there's been lots of issues of violations and compliance. This pattern is consistent. It's going to continue. And I think really respectfully, and I'll finish with this last thought, one of the most pronounced ones that just finished, so Chris was given one of those placards that he was supposed to prominently post, right? For the entire time leading up to this meeting. He tacked it onto a tree. 3 days into it, it had rained and had completely folded over. And I have a picture of it in my phone. It was not visible. Why was Chris not compliant? The rules are very clear about what he's supposed to do, and he didn't do it. And in fact, it compromises this entire process because it is supposed to be prominently displayed, ready to be seen by anyone. And that has not been the case. My final comment, and I'll finish with this. I talk to a lot of the neighbors, a lot of the time. I love my community. I love my neighbors. I talk with them. I've spoken to a lot of them. One of the things that Chris has additionally been saying, he's not actually worried about this today because he's friends with the county commissioners, and the county commissioners are going to approve what he's asking. He has said this to people. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that's something you should be informed about. I believe the county commissioners should be informed about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. I think we're all very familiar with being overruled by the county commissioners, but that's their job. Ours is to advise. Ours is to consider the criteria that you've been looking at here for a while. And I hesitate, but I'll ask any other comments from the audience. I don't see any. I think I've waited an adequate amount of time, so I will close the public comment period and now allow the applicant to come back and make some final comments to address those concerns or add whatever else they have to this.
Mr. Chair, I don't have anybody signed in here, so if I don't refer to them by name as I address their comments, please forgive me.
Yeah, I think there's another sheet someplace, but
Okay.
yeah.
Miranda, did that get disseminated, what we sent? Okay. No, we didn't do this. Right, let me see. This one. Which one is it, Miranda? That was very confusing for me. It shouldn't have been. So, you know, the comments about character, those are probably pretty hurtful for Mr. Jeub. Maybe some of it's deserved. I don't know, right? I wasn't part of some of that. Talking about intent, though, and I think the big red, or they call it big red, is at the heart of a lot of it. When Mr. Jeub already had his special use approval administratively, he sent an email to staff, and you've all been around me long enough. I hate this. I don't want to throw staff under the bus ever, because they're doing the best they can. They're working really hard. But for the record, it needs to be very clear that Mr. Jeub said, I'd like to switch out, and this is what this email is about. I'd like to switch out one of my tents for a hard-sided structure. He even referred to it as an RV. It's right here. And the response that he got was, we'll just add it to your site development plan. So the special use had already been approved with the notes on it that said it has to all be tents. And then he asked to switch one of those out for the hard side structure from a tent, and staff's response was, we'll add it to the administratively approved site development plan. So it doesn't negate, bringing it in because his plan said that, but it goes to the confusion of the matter, which is he's trying to do the right thing, and he at the time tried to do the right thing by getting approved.
And we're not code enforcement. We don't, and I know you know that,
Right.
but for the audience, I've let it go very, quite a long ways that we've talked about the history that's less relevant, not as relevant to this specific application as I think it should be. I'd like to focus the conversation on that. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just trying to back up from where I allowed this, pull us back from where I allowed us to go up until this point.
And I completely agree with you, Mr. Chair. What I heard from the legal counsel, and sir, I didn't catch your name, I apologize. He suggested in part of his remarks is that past behavior can be used in this hearing against the applicant. Sort of to suggest that that's part of the criteria that you're being asked to apply today. And it's not. Is it bad? Maybe. But it's not. Per what you're charged with, the criteria doesn't say, do you want to punish somebody for bad behavior? That's not the criteria. You may, intuitively do that, but to suggest, have an attorney get up and tell you that you can do that, that is just factually inaccurate. So I want to dispel that right now.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Dossi, I'm hoping you'll go through, I'm not sure I understand this. He's saying that he wants to change one, and then
right here.
Ms. Matthew is saying add it to his letter of intent.
For the site development plan.
And that is after
the special use.
After the special use was approved, but before the next code violation, was that ever acted on?
So after that, they said, get the site development plan done. And then he said, well, I want to do more hard-sided structures. And that's what spun into this. My point is, it created a lot of confusion of, is this part of my special use, or is this just something I put on the site development plan? It's just going to the comments about you knew what you were doing. Well, he has to rely on staff to guide him correctly. And in this case, with this response, the assumption was, I guess it's okay under the special use. I just add it to my site development plan.
Again, I don't want to
I
go
just
back
wanna
and
understand-
adjudicate
yeah,
the history, but it's the confusion of, was this request to the staff. The response seems to indicate that, okay, we're good. We'll change the site development plan, and that fits the approval that you've already been given a year plus ago.
And what my client has said is, look, I'd rather just all be considered water under the bridge, this application be judged on its merits. And that's what I want, the rest of my comments want to focus on.
And I concur with Mr., but that just says add the changes to the, I don't see anything there that says it's fine. I see add it to your letter of intent. Okay, I just want to,
So I guess
I want to be looking at this, I want us to agree on what the document is saying, not you think it says A and I think it says B, but it really says C.
I guess what I'm not saying is, what probably should have been said here is, you can't do that under your special use, you need to amend your special use. Instead, it was added to your administratively approved site development plan and nothing about the special use that was already approved. That's all. So we don't need to belabor that. The legal counsel suggested that this is all about forgiveness. It's not. You have 8 now. He's asking for permission to do 12. Obviously, there is some forgiveness on the type of structure. That's what's coming to you. We don't have evidence of this, but in their conversations with the neighbors, most of them at the time preferred it be a hard-sided structure. They're more visually appealing. Frankly, in my opinion, you probably minimize noise because I can hear through every tent at a campground. I don't hear too many people inside of an RV or a container. But that was some of the feedback he'd gotten, was we actually don't like the tents because we're afraid of the homelessness and the vagrancy. We'd rather it be a more defined structure. Thus the reason why he started pushing in that direction. Plus, they could rent them out better. The suggestion that there's a sort of a disrespect for county government, this email suggests that he was actually reaching out to get that approval, to get that guidance. Maybe there, in terms of code enforcement, you could probably draw that conclusion in some ways, but this suggests that there's at least been an attempt to try to do things the right way. The council said there's a tent occupancy up to 6, but then he said there's 2 bunk beds and a queen. I don't know if people sleeping in a queen bed, but I think bunk beds are usually 1 each and queens probably 2, so that is 4. I don't know how we got to 6 on that. His math suggested 44 guests. That probably is the case, and maybe this goes to Mr. Markowicz's comment about number of cars. That's how you kind of control that. There was a discussion about, and legal counsel brought up other non-residential uses that are happening in the neighborhood. Many of those are also identified as special uses. That's why we're here, right? I'm guessing most of those are probably grandfathered in, but even a lot of home-based businesses require approval by the county because they can blow up to be something much bigger than what people plan for, right, when they start the business. So to say this is far different than a home-based business, they all start small and then they grow. And it's when do you need to move and when do you need to go somewhere else? That's the discussion that we've had for years on these types of uses. Many comments about what happened previously in terms of we were opposed and then we withdrew. And that could be the case, or some said they were still in opposition. The county sent out a notice, right? The previous director under that guidance sent out a notice. There was no opposition received. So if people were still in opposition, why didn't they respond with a opposition? We can't even find the notice that the county sent out in EDARP. But there is a notice that was sent out by Mr. Jeub that in no way mentioned tent. Didn't even use the word tent. It said recreation camp. So to draw a conclusion that presumption was it's always going to be tents, that was not the notice that was sent to the neighbors. The legal notice about the specific special use. It didn't say tents. Now, the special use site plan definitely showed tent. We will completely agree with that. But for the neighbors to say we're always under the impression it was tents, the legal notice sent by Mr. Jeub said nothing about tents. It said recreation camp. We can bring that document up if we need to. And we can't even find the notice that the county sent out. So we don't know what the county sent as the intent of this site, but what the applicant himself sent out just said recreation camp. Legal counsel stated that hard-sided structures, 9 hard-sided structures, cannot be rural in nature. What if those hard-sided structures are cabins? Can a cabin go into a rural area? The only difference is this is actually probably an improvement on top of a cabin, frankly, and probably will last longer. The answer is yes. And the Land Development Code says so. The reason why it says so is the only zoning districts that allow for recreation camp under the Land Development Code by special use are the Forestry Zone District, both Agricultural Zone Districts, the R5 Zone District, which is the one we're talking about, and the RT, which is Residential Topographic. So if cabins can't go into a rural area, why are they allowed in a recreation camp in all of those zones I just read off? So to say that this isn't a transition from urban to the rural lots is, based on the Land Development Code, is just flat out false. Because the Land Development Code has identified the most rural zone districts. If you look at the zone districts in the Land Development Code, those are the most rural ones. And has said this is a rural use. Whether it looks like a container or a cabin, to suggest that hard-sided structures somehow only go into an urban area, Land Development Code says they can't even go in an urban area. They have to go in a rural area. There's a comment about the noise associated with propane heaters. Those are all radiant heaters. Radiant heaters don't put off noise. There's no noise being created by any of the heat that happens on site. I would also argue that during the wintertime, highly unlikely people are going to be outside when it's really cold. If we're going to occupy more when it's cold because they're hard-sided structures, you can also draw the conclusion that people also aren't going to be out making as much noise, causing many impacts to the neighbors when it's cold. I think that's a pretty fair conclusion to draw. Mr. Phillips, thank you for your comments. It's not easy to get up and talk. And I won't attack him. That's not what I want to do. But obviously, there's a personal relationship there, and those are meaningful, and they kind of hurt sometimes when things don't go right. He was told by my client that it's going to be tents. It's going to be a certain number. It was only when the county wanted to see this additional mitigation that Mr. Jeub said, I can't afford to keep doing this way. There has to be more revenue. That's when the additional 4 sites came up. So maybe he probably should have reached out to the neighbors and said, I'm now doing 12. He was working with the county, but I mean, that's the reality of it, right? That's how business works. You got to adjust, and you got to make sure, you're in the black and not in the red. Mr. Phillips also brought up some conversation he had with Regional Building. He did not provide documentation of that conversation. He didn't provide a name of anybody he spoke to. It may not have even happened as far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure our council over here will agree that's hearsay, right? So we can make up whatever we want, but if there's no documentation from Regional Building saying this is out of compliance, then the presumption is it is in compliance. And nobody has provided that yet. Council didn't, nor did the neighbor. Maybe the conversation happened. I don't want to discredit the individual who said it, but we have to go off fact here. So Mr. Jeub has told you they've been permitted, all the electrical connections. And, for my purposes, that's part of this record. The posted notice, I think it's kind of going towards the character again of Mr. Jeub. Mr. Jeub posted the notice per county instructions, and then he was in Tennessee when I think it folded in half. If you look at the posting, it's pretty flimsy cardboard. I probably should have improved that when I was here. But there was no intent to deceive or hide it or whatever. Those things happen. The comments about being friends with county commissioners, hopefully you realize with my presentation, I've purposely tried to focus on the review criteria because that's your job. And that's the Board of County Commissioners' job. It doesn't matter who your friends are. If you can't find in favor of the criteria, then it's a recommendation of denial. I think we've made a very compelling case that it meets every one of those criteria. If you take the character conversation out or the intent conversation out and you do it based on the merits of the application, it meets every single one of the criteria. Chris, would you like to say anything else? Thank you all for your time. I hope you get a raise soon for this position, but I'm not hopeful.
Something else you should have addressed when you were in charge.
Should have done earlier. Well, the application speaks for itself. And I thank you for your time. And I just want to publicly say in the record, I thank my neighbors. They've been keeping my feet to the fire since the beginning of this, and complying and everything. The timeline that Steve mentioned, the meeting online was invited. In fact, Steve let me know he wasn't able to make that, but I did say 8/10 at the time. Then 3 months later, that's when the discussion of 4 more units came on. So I honestly am trying my hardest to be compliant with a very new and unique idea called glamping. And it's incredibly cool and a lot of fun, and I want to continue doing it and serving the community that way. But I'm trying to fit this square peg in a round hole, and I hope we do it today. So.
Thank you. Mr. Moraes, you had a question for
I just
the
have
applicant.
one question. That single family home on the lot, is that where you live? Is that your residence?
Yes, that's where I live.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for us? I'm happy to answer any.
I don't think so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So we've heard from the public, we've heard a rebuttal or a final statement from the applicant. Fellow commissioners, do you have any questions? I know Mr. Carlson has to leave here pretty soon, so I'll give you an opportunity pretty early in the process. I see Mr. Markowitz down here. Probably have you have a question first?
I have a question.
Well, we'll go with the question, and then Mr. Carlson, if you want to say anything, we'll let you have it.
I want to understand the covenants. It sounds like there's recorded covenants that say that there are no temporary living structures. I realize the county does not enforce that. And in my neighborhood, we have a voluntary HOA, and they enforce the covenants for each one. So and maybe it's a county attorney question when they don't reconcile, like can a county approve some special use that's not allowed by covenants? And if that were to happen, could the neighbors override what the county said?
So the answer to your first question is yes, the county does not consider the covenants when denying or approving land use applications. So you certainly could approve it even if there's an argument that it may violate the covenants. The flip side of that, however, is that the county approval does not negate the covenants. So even if the county approves it under its land use process, the neighbors still have an opportunity to enforce any violation of the covenants that they see fit.
Thank you.
I have one question for the county attorney. I just need a little bit of education when we look at section 532, the special use in the land development code. I'll tell you as you pull it up. Just let me know and I'll ask the question. Okay, so I'm looking at subparagraph G, the limited to approve special uses. It says any land on which a special use permit is approved shall be limited to those uses and structures enumerated within the special use permit and no more than one principal allowed use. Most of the time we get these special uses for these home occupations, which is our secondary uses. But this recreation camp is a primary allowed use, and the single-family dwelling is a primary allowed use. My question is having this special use of a recreation camp on this property, would that be two principal uses? The single-family home and the recreation camp? I can give the counter argument to myself. I can argue against myself. I'm totally capable of doing that.
I think that's a great question. Before I attempted to answer that, I would appreciate an opportunity to speak with the planning director to make sure we're on the same page.
Okay.
We'll come back to that. Unfortunately, before we leave today, we're going to hear from the consultant who's going to help us fix problems in our land development code.
If that's a problem.
That. So yeah, if it's a problem.
If
we identify this as a problem, we can put it on the list. Other questions? Again, I'll go ahead and open for comment. Again, I'm conscious of the fact that Mr. Carlson's going to have to leave. We will then appoint, flip a coin here, pick a number between 1 and 5, and I'll figure out who gets to vote. But we'll let Jay have his say. But we may not be able to vote here in the next 5 minutes. We'll see. It's up to you guys, not me.
Great, thank you. To me, it just comes down to what we talked about earlier, fairly simple, is that this was approved based on tents. Both the executive director and the county attorney confirmed that, and now we're coming to, in my mind, what's a drastically different business to be in the neighborhood with the hard-sided large structures and so forth and so on. So again, in my mind, this is a largely different application than was originally presented. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Other comments, Mr. Markowicz?
I think just for staff to make sure that we put into our list of things to do with the code update, the definitions of permanent structures versus RVs versus tiny homes, that obviously is part of this question. So I just want to make sure that we make that put that on a list as things that we do. And then secondly, if somebody makes a motion, I'd like you to consider conditions. I don't know how you do it, but limiting guests maybe, but specifically limiting to the 20-foot, 10-foot by 20-foot connexes versus anything larger than that. So put some restrictions on it. Those are just my comments. Again, I don't know if I'll be able to vote or not, but.
Thank you. Other comments? Mr. Trowbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank everybody from the public for being here. We do appreciate you coming and giving us the benefits of your experiences and insights into what's going on in the neighborhood itself, because obviously we live all over the place, so we don't necessarily know. So thank you all, and thanks for your patience with the process. I know it can be very frustrating, perhaps, to wait through all of this, but so thank you for all of that. I didn't find anything in the letter of intent, since we were talking about the special use being bound by that letter going forward. I didn't see anything in the text that limited the sites to either tents or any other structure. The only thing I found was 2 sites on the drawing, the site drawing that was in there, explicitly shown as tents. So presumably the other 10 sites can be those connex type of hard-sided or some other kind of hard-sided structure, perhaps. So to me, that means we've got the existing house on the site plus 10 other small homes, as it were, even though they're tiny. So that gives us 11 homes on really less than 6 acres, because you've got the eastern side of the lot down by the creek. So at a generous thing, it's 1.8 dwelling units per acre, which is denser than what's supposed to be there with the density of that area. The covenants, as noted, that's a civil matter, so you guys would have to go to court civilly and fight that out if you wanted to try and enforce that. The attorney mentioned something about revoking the existing special use. That's not something we can do. It's already in place. That would actually have to come from the Board of County Commissioners, as Mr. Moraes noted, under the Land Development Code under 5.3.2, subparagraph J. There's actually a administration. I think at the BOCC, I think would have to initiate the process to ask the staff to evaluate compliance with the special use permit that's already in place. So if you wanted to get that revoked, I think that would have to be how that would we go about that. Anyway, bottom line, as far as this application goes today, given everything in the staff report, what I've learned here today and heard from the neighbors and stuff, I find that this application is not compatible with the neighborhood. And while I understand perhaps why the staff originally did this administratively, I would not have done that. And since it's not compatible, then it fails the criteria, and I will be against. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trowbridge. Ms. Fuller?
I appreciate that email that you brought up, Mr. Dossi, because it does show that there has been some communication, clearly not an approval, but that it makes me feel less bad about it. I second what Mr. Trowbridge was saying. I don't think a cost to mitigate to become in compliance when you're out of compliance with code. That's not, it's not persuasive to me for a reason to approve this. I believe that 8 tents seasonally, not awesome, but it was not terrible. So, and I think that seasonal camp, temporary tents, that seems reasonable to me. I think when you're going into the tiny home, the permanent structures, that's a different animal in my opinion. And I agree, I don't believe this is compatible, and I will also be against.
Thank you. Mr. Moraes?
Yeah, I just want to concur with Mr. Trowbridge and actually maybe look at it from a different perspective. This is large lot residential place type, which the land developer, or the master plan talks about being one dwelling unit per 2.5 acres. This is 6.44 acres. So if you kind of do the math, well, how many dwelling units would you really kind of see in that large lot residential? And it comes out to about 2.5, right, if you do the ratios. And then I asked the question earlier about, hey, well, what's the occupation rate of this? And the respondent response was about 50%. So if you take the 12 units and you say, okay, at 50%, that's 6 are going to be occupied at some point all year round. And then you add it with the single family dwelling, you really have basically 7 dwelling units per acre that are being occupied, at some point for the full year. And that's exceeds, in my view, what large lot residential place type should really be looking like.
Mr. Whitney?
You were expecting me, weren't you?
Well, I'm giving everyone an opportunity, so I was looking this way first.
I was going to wait until after the vote, but I'll do it now, if that's okay.
You don't feel obligated to do it now, but if you'd like to make a comment, go ahead.
So I'm in agreement with my fellow commissioners who have said they're opposed. We had a blizzard of information today, a lot of which was not even relevant to the question. I realize tourism is important, and I realize economic development is important, none of which has anything to do with whether or not it's appropriate to put 9 hard, sided dwellings on a piece of property that was approved for 8 tent sites. So I'm going to be opposed because I think it's completely incompatible. It's not really a modification of the earlier special use. It's a brand new application in my mind, totally different and should be reviewed that way. So I'll be opposed.
Thank you, Mr. Whitney. Mr. Shipples?
Yeah, I just wanted to, along with everyone else, I'm not in favor of this. And just to point out something that, the email that's up on the screen was talked about adding an RV site to it, and that email looks like it was sent from Chris Jeub on March 30th. And looking at the packet in the background, it says that in March of 23, which this is March 30th of 23, the email. In March of 23, code enforcement received complaints about the recreational vehicle. So I don't think he was asking for permission there. He had already gotten cited for a code violation, and then he wanted to change it. And just the timing and all this stuff and the various violations that have happened and the hard-sided sites as opposed to the tent sites, just don't think are compatible either. So,
Mr. Smith or Mr. Byers, would anybody like to make a comment? No obligation to?
Negative, nope.
Okay. Thank you. I'll say a couple of things.
Ms. Segal may have an answer to my question.
Ms. Segal, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't like to answer brand new legal questions on the fly, but in this case, I've had a brief opportunity to discuss this with the planning director, And I do read that provision to allow a principal allowed use, and in the case where a special use permit has been granted, a special use on the same parcel of property. And my rationale for that is that while both a recreational camp and a single-family residence are principal uses, one is an allowed use and one is a special use. And those two types of uses are pretty well distinguished throughout the code as being different, even though they may both be principal uses. One is an allowed use by right, and one is a special use requiring further approval.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up to that? I think
Now it's your
we're happy. Again, I'll say a few things, and first of all, thank you to my fellow commissioners and to the public for being part of this. You've asked the hard questions. I'm a little discouraged sometimes because when we have these contentious applications, a lot of the discussion is very speculative, very oftentimes, as I would argue today, accusatory in terms of the applicants and assumes motives or implies motives that may not necessarily be in evidence. And that bothers me a little bit because that clouds the issue of what we're trying to look at. I take a different view on this, and I certainly appreciate the opinions of my fellow commissioners who have spoken. I think, and I take a broader view perhaps of the master plan, and as Mr. Dossi pointed out, there are definitely provisions of the master plan, not necessarily in the land use section, but in the master plan as a whole. And it's a master plan because it's not just a land use plan, but things that portions of that master plan encourage economic development, encourage this kind of thing. And I see it very much as an entrepreneurial use, something we're trying to drive economic development. We're trying to support tourism, or the application is trying to do that. And so I'm persuaded with that. I'm also persuaded that given where this location is, and largely because of some of the limits of the topography of this location, that it is compatible with the neighborhood or in harmony with the character of the neighborhood. It's not building another house right there or a couple of other houses right next to it, but because of the nature of this, I believe that it is in harmony with the neighborhood. I think that the existing special use is definitely there. The expansion that this application would have, requests, is still within that and still in harmony with that. So that's my opinion on this. I'm comfortable being in the minority, but that's and fortunately I don't get the sole vote. I guess maybe not fortunately, but I'd love to have the sole vote in a lot of things. This isn't one of them. It's a group. Ms. Jack, last word.
Okay, the last word. I concur with you, Mr. Bailey, and I appreciate you always articulating it so well. Thank you.
Thank you. Last chance up and down the aisle. I'll start on this side first. I don't see any eye contact or anybody that really is leaning for their buttons. So given the discussion, I will entertain a motion on, don't have the file number here. Somewhere it's here, file number 6A, item number 6A, file number AL2321, special use modification for Monument Glamping number 1.
Mr. Chair.
Trowbridge.
Thank you. As regards agenda item 6A, file number AL2321, a special use modification for Monument Glamping 1, I move that we recommend denial of this application and that this be forwarded to the Board of County Commissioners for their consideration.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Whitney, a second.
I have one question. So can we add, so I'm against it, but if this goes to the county commissioners, I'd like to make a recommendation to adjust conditions.
How can you do that?
Can I?
Yeah, we've
Or is it done?
the motion is for denial.
All
So
right.
there will not be any changes to it. If it would have been to approve with conditions, that's a different
Right.
matter.
Yeah, there would have to be something that carries the conditions forward. And the denial doesn't carry those conditions.
But I suspect that the transcript and the record of this will have the different ideas and the different conditions that we.
She can certainly comment.
Suggest.
Oh, I'll make some
You
comments.
can comment at the end, sure. Okay, we have a motion to deny, a motion to disapprove this application, and I will go down the aisle, starting with Mr. Schippel.
Wait, who seconded?
I'm sorry, yes, was, Mr. Whitney seconded.
Mr. Whitney seconded.
Yes, there was a second, so I wasn't completely out of order. This time. We have a motion by Mr. Trowbridge and a second by Mr. Whitney and Mr. Schippels.
Aye.
Mr. Carlson.
Aye.
Mr. Trowbridge.
Aye.
Ms. Fuller.
Aye.
Ms. Jack.
No.
Mr. Moraes.
Aye.
Mr. Whitney. Aye. And Mr. Byers.
Aye.
And the chair will join Ms. Jack and vote no, showing that we have a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners for disapproval of this with a vote of 7-2. Would you like to add anything to any comments to your vote in opposition first? Okay. I think everything's been said that I need said. Now I will allow for some other comments. Ms. Fuller.
The condition about the changing that to outdoor lighting should be considered. And then I would recommend an additional condition that it would only be tent only on all 12 sites.
I'd like to make a comment. Okay. Seeing that, I think we have finished that item, and I believe those are all of our regular items, and I will now call a recess for 20 minutes-ish. Is that right? Yeah, about 1:30. We'll be back here and go to our non-action items, agenda items 7A and B.